Sometimes the people who hurt you the most are the ones who share your blood. Emma Sullivan learned that lesson at 37 years old, sitting in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money, watching her siblings divide up their grandmother's estate like wolves tearing at a carcass. But that morning started differently. It started with cold. The Honda's windows had frosted over during the night, transforming the Walmart parking lot into a blur of sodium lights and early morning delivery trucks. Emma woke at 5:30 to the familiar ache in her lower back, the one that came from sleeping in a driver's seat for the 207th night in a row. 7 months. They had been homeless for 7 months, and her body kept a precise count of every uncomfortable hour. She turned carefully, moving with the practiced silence of someone who had learned that sudden movements attracted attention from security guards and concerned strangers alike. The rearview mirror showed her own face, pale and drawn in the pre-dawn darkness, eyes carrying shadows that no amount of concealer could hide. At 37, she looked older. Poverty aged you in ways that had nothing to do with wrinkles. It carved itself into the set of your jaw, the wariness in your eyes, the way you held your shoulders like you were always bracing for the next blow. In the back seat, Sophie slept under 3 winter coats. Her 9-year-old face was peaceful in a way that broke Emma's heart every single morning. The girl had adapted to this life with a resilience that felt both miraculous and deeply wrong. No child should know how to sleep in a car without complaint. No child should wake up and immediately check if anyone had noticed them parked there overnight. No child should understand at 9 years old that asking for things only made her mother cry when she thought no one was watching. Emma's phone glowed in the darkness. 5:32. The store opened at 6. They had 28 minutes to transform themselves from what they were into what they needed to appear to be. Just another mother and daughter arriving for early morning shopping. Not refugees from a life that had collapsed around them like a house made of cards and broken promises. She reached for her wallet in the cup holder and opened it with fingers stiff from cold. The math was simple and brutal, the kind of arithmetic that had become as familiar as breathing. $23.47. That was everything, the entirety of what stood between them and the complete absence of options. $12 for gas to get to work and back for 3 days. That left $11.47 for food. Peanut butter sandwiches again. Maybe apples if they were on sale. Maybe just the peanut butter eaten with plastic spoons from the glove compartment, pretending it was a fun adventure rather than the only meal they could afford. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Emma almost ignored it. At this hour, unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors who had somehow gotten her new number, or automated messages about extended warranties, or the kind of bad news that arrived before dawn because tragedy never respected reasonable hours. But she had learned something in these 7 months of sleeping in parking lots and washing her hair in gym sinks. Bad news did not improve with waiting. Ignoring reality only gave it time to grow teeth. She answered on the third ring. The voice on the other end was professionally gentle, the kind of tone that lawyers practiced in front of mirrors, rehearsing how to deliver information that would change lives forever. William Patterson from Patterson and Associates, he said. He was calling about Grace Sullivan, Emma's grandmother, the woman who had been the only one, the only family member who called after Michael left, the only one who said, maybe this is not your fault, when the divorce lawyer explained that Emma's teaching salary meant she could not afford to fight for the house. The only one who had not said, I told you so, when Emma finally admitted, voice breaking over a phone line stretched across 300 miles of Colorado highway, that she was sleeping in her car with her daughter because there was nowhere else to go. Grace had passed away 3 days ago. The funeral had been yesterday. Emma pressed her free hand against her mouth to keep the sound inside. She had not known. Nobody had told her. Nobody had thought to call the homeless sister, the failure, the one who taught art to ungrateful teenagers for $37,000 a year, while her brother built empires and her sister made partner at law firms that charged more per hour than Emma made in a day. The will reading would be Monday morning at 10. Mr. Patterson's voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who had done this too many times to be moved by the grief it caused. But there was something underneath. Something that might have been sympathy or might have been professional obligation. Either way, it did not matter. Grace was gone. The only person in her family who had ever looked at Emma and seen something worth believing in was dead. and Emma had not even been able to say goodbye. She lowered the phone and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The plastic was cold against her skin. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one fighting against the sob that wanted to escape, that demanded release, that pressed against her chest like a living thing trying to claw its way out. In the backseat, Sophie stirred. Her small voice cut through the pre-dawn darkness with the kind of knowing that children of crisis develop too young. The kind of awareness that Emma would have given anything to spare her daughter from learning. "Is it Grandma Grace?" Emma turned, wiping her eyes before her daughter could see. But Sophie was already sitting up, already reading her mother's face with that terrible perceptiveness that came from 9 years of learning to interpret adult silences. She had grown up too fast. They both had. "The funeral was yesterday, baby. I'm sorry, I did not know." Sophie's chin trembled. Her lower lip disappeared between her teeth, pressed there by force of will alone. 9 years old and already practicing the art of swallowing grief so her mother would not crack. Emma wanted to scream at the universe for teaching her daughter this skill, for taking a child who should be worrying about spelling tests and playground friendships, and turning her into someone who knew how to measure the weight of bad news by the tension in her mother's shoulders. "There is a will reading on Monday. The lawyer says Grandma left instructions, specific things she wanted us to have." The hope that flickered in Sophie's eyes made Emma's chest tighten with something close to physical pain. She knew what her daughter was thinking. She was thinking the same thing herself, even though she knew better than to hope. Maybe enough for an apartment deposit. Maybe enough for first and last month's rent. Maybe enough to stop sleeping in parking lots and pretending this was an adventure. A fun camping trip that had somehow lasted 7 months and showed no signs of ending. "We should get ready for school." Emma forced steadiness into her voice. "Early bird catches the worm, right?" Sophie nodded and started folding the coats with practiced efficiency. They had a routine. It had taken weeks to develop, this careful choreography of survival. But now it flowed with the smoothness of long practice. Emma would walk Sophie to the Walmart bathroom where they would wash up in the sink, brush teeth using the travel kit stored under the passenger seat, change clothes from the plastic bins in the trunk that held everything they owned in the world. Then McDonald's for dollar menu breakfast, if they could afford it, or the protein bars from the glove compartment if they could not. Today was a protein bar day. Tomorrow would be too. And the day after that, until Friday when her paycheck would hit her account and vanish almost immediately into the endless hungry mouths of bills and obligations that never stopped demanding to be fed. The memory hit Emma without warning, sharp enough to steal breath. 6 months ago, not even 6 months. Brandon's voice on the phone when Emma had finally broken down and called her brother for help. She had rehearsed what she would say for 3 days, practicing the words in the bathroom at school during her free period, trying to find the right combination of syllables that would make him understand without making her sound pathetic. She had failed at that, apparently. "You made your choices, Emma. Teaching art to teenagers does not pay bills. I cannot enable poor life decisions." She had asked for $2,000, just $2,000, enough for an apartment deposit and 1 month's rent, enough to give Sophie a bedroom with a door that locked, enough to stop teaching her daughter that homelessness was normal, that mothers and daughters sleeping in cars was just another way families lived. Brandon had said no. Brandon, who drove a Tesla that cost more than Emma would make in 2 years of teaching. Brandon, who lived in a penthouse downtown with a view of the city that spread out below him like a kingdom awaiting his pleasure. Brandon, who had built a $50 million tech company before he turned 40 and never once looked back at the people he had left behind. $2,000 was enabling poor decisions. $2,000 was more than he was willing to spend on his sister and niece, even though he probably spent more than that every month on the subscription services he forgot to cancel. The gym opened at 5:30 on weekdays. Emma had maintained her $29 membership for one reason only, and it had nothing to do with fitness. She had not run on a treadmill or lifted a weight in 7 months. What she did, what she needed, what kept her and Sophie looking like normal people instead of refugees from their own lives, was simple. The showers were clean, they were private, and they had hot water that did not run out after 5 minutes. They arrived at 5:45. Emma carried a backpack with their towels and clean clothes. Sophie held her school uniform in a careful bundle, protecting it from the early morning dew like it was made of gold instead of navy polyester and white cotton. The teenager at the front desk barely looked up from her phone. This was the ideal scenario. Emma and Sophie walked past with practiced casualness, neither too fast nor too slow, projecting the confidence of people who belonged here rather than people who were using a gym membership as their only access to regular bathing. The women's locker room was empty at this hour. Emma and Sophie had perfected the art of looking like they belonged, moving with the unhurried purpose of early morning fitness enthusiasts rather than the desperate efficiency of homeless people stealing 30 minutes of normalcy before the real world came crashing back. Quick showers. Efficient. No lingering. Emma stood under the spray and let herself have exactly 30 seconds of something close to luxury. The heat worked into her perpetually tense shoulders, loosening muscles that had forgotten what relaxation felt like. She closed her eyes and pretended, just for those 30 seconds, that she was somewhere else. Someone else. A woman who had a home to return to, a bed to sleep in, a life that did not require constant calculation of every dollar and every moment. Then the 30 seconds ended and she was herself again. Homeless, broke, standing in a gym shower at 5:50 in the morning, washing her hair with hotel shampoo samples she had collected from the housekeeping cart at the Holiday Inn Express before they got kicked out of their last temporary housing. When they emerged, Sophie looked like any other fourth grader heading to St. Catherine's Elementary. Navy jumper, white polo shirt, hair in neat braids that Emma had learned to do in the car using a battery-powered camping lantern for light. The uniform was 2 years old and the hem had been let out twice, but it was clean. Emma had made sure of that. Whatever else fell apart, whatever else she could not control or fix or hold together, Sophie's uniform stayed pristine. Emma's own clothes were Target clearance rack. 3 years old, wearing thin at the elbows and the knees, but they were professional enough for teaching, for standing in front of teenagers who were mostly thinking about their phones and their social lives, for pretending to be a normal woman with a normal life instead of someone who would be sleeping in a parking lot again tonight. She had learned to tie scarves in ways that disguised the fraying collar of her one good blouse. Art teacher chic, she used to joke in better days. Now it was just survival. Another small deception in a life that had become nothing but small deceptions stacked on top of each other like a house of cards waiting for the wrong breath of wind. They drove in silence to St. Catherine's. Emma pulled into the carpool lane with 3 minutes to spare, joining the parade of minivans and SUVs driven by parents who had homes to return to after drop-off. Parents who would go back to kitchens with coffee makers and refrigerators full of food, to living rooms with comfortable couches and televisions that did not require stealing Wi-Fi from adjacent businesses. The hug lasted 5 seconds longer than usual. Sophie squeezed hard enough that Emma felt it in her ribs, a grip that communicated everything her daughter could not say out loud. I am scared. I miss Grandma. I want to go home. When are we going to have a home again? I love you, Mom. Love you more, baby. Then Sophie was walking toward the early drop-off program, with her backpack bouncing against her narrow shoulders, and Emma was alone with her grief and her fear and the cold reality of another day pretending everything was fine. She drove across town to Henderson High, where she taught Introduction to Studio Art to teenagers who mostly cared more about their phones than perspective drawing or value scales or any of the other skills she spent her days trying to share. She parked in the teacher's lot. She walked through the morning chill with her lesson plans in one hand and her grandmother's death sitting heavy in her chest like a stone she could not put down. The other teachers in the break room were discussing weekend plans. Someone was going skiing. Someone else had tickets to a concert. Normal conversations between normal people with normal lives, filling the air with words that seemed to come from a different planet than the one Emma inhabited. She poured coffee from the communal pot and nodded along, contributing nothing. Sarah from English asked if Emma was okay. She looked tired. Maya smiled and blamed allergies, that reliable excuse that explained red eyes and worn expressions without requiring further questions. Then she escaped to her classroom where she could be alone with her thoughts and her grief in the suffocating weight of another day pretending. Her students filed in at 7:50, 23 juniors who ranged from genuinely interested in art to actively hostile to anything that required putting down their phones for more than 30 seconds. Emma launched into her lesson on value scales, demonstrating shading techniques on the whiteboard while her mind wandered miles away. To Monday morning, to William Patterson's professionally gentle voice, to the wild, desperate hope that maybe Grace had left something that would change their lives. The days between that phone call and Monday moved like cold honey, thick and slow and impossible to rush. Emma taught her classes, she graded papers, she attended the faculty meeting on Friday afternoon, and nodded at appropriate moments while the principal discussed budget cuts and standardized testing and all the other concerns that seemed impossibly distant from the reality of her actual life. Friday afternoon, she cashed her biweekly paycheck, $2,180, deposited directly into an account that had been empty since Wednesday. By the time she finished paying what had to be paid, the math left her breathless. 900 to the storage unit. Everything they owned sat in a 10 by 10 space on the edge of town, waiting for a day when they would have somewhere to put it. 420 to car insurance, because without the car, they had nothing. 250 to the minimum payment on credit cards she had maxed out during the divorce, buying groceries and gas and the desperate necessities of survival. That left $610 for the next month. Gas, food, Sophie's lunch money, phone bill, gym membership, and the constant terrifying knowledge that one car repair would destroy them. One unexpected expense, one mistake, one moment of bad luck, and they would fall from barely surviving into something worse. She allowed herself 120 for this trip, gas to Denver and back. Maybe food if they found a cheap option. Maybe nothing at all if the numbers did not work out. The will reading was Monday at 10. She would drive up Sunday evening, sleep in the car in a parking lot she knew from previous trips, and walk into that conference room looking like someone who had a right to be there. She would not think about what happened if the will contained nothing. She could not afford to think about that. Monday morning arrived with unseasonable cold. Emma had parked in a structure near the lawyer's office, paying $12 for a space that let her and Sophie change into their best clothes without attracting attention. Best clothes meant Emma's one funeral-appropriate dress and Sophie's school uniform, because it was the nicest thing she owned. The law office occupied the 8th floor of a building downtown that screamed money in every brass fixture and polished marble tile. Emma and Sophie rode the elevator in silence, both dressed in their best, both pretending confidence they did not feel, both carrying the weight of hopes they were afraid to name. The receptionist directed them to a conference room that could have held Emma's entire classroom twice over. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the same view Brandon probably had from his penthouse, the same reminder that some people lived in a different world entirely. A table that probably cost more than Emma made in a year dominated the center of the room. Leather chairs whispered expense every time they moved. William Patterson was already there, arranging papers with the careful precision of a man who had done this too many times to be moved by the grief it caused. He looked up as Emma entered, and something in his eyes softened, something that might have been recognition or pity or the particular expression lawyers reserve for family members who clearly did not belong in rooms like this. "Miss Sullivan, thank you for coming. Please sit." Emma and Sophie took seats on one side of the massive table. Patterson poured water from a crystal pitcher into glasses that probably cost $50 each. Emma's mouth was desert dry, but she could not bring herself to drink. Not yet. Not until she knew. "Are we waiting for Brandon and Vanessa? They should be here shortly." His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. "Can I get you anything? Coffee? There are pastries in the break room." "We are fine, thank you." Sophie's hand found Emma's under the table. Small fingers squeezed tight, seeking reassurance that Emma was not sure she could provide. She squeezed back anyway. Whatever else she could not give her daughter, she could give her this: a hand to hold, a presence to lean against, a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. The door opened at 10:05. Brandon arrived first, phone pressed to his ear, barely acknowledging Emma's presence. He dressed for this the way he dressed for everything. Tom Ford suit that probably cost $3,000. Apple Watch Ultra catching the light. Hair perfectly styled in that way that required a $200 monthly maintenance plan. He ended his call and dropped into a chair across from Emma without greeting her. Just a quick glance assessing and dismissing in a single motion, and then back to his phone. Emma could see the Tesla app open on his screen. He was checking something about his car from 8 floors up, while their grandmother's will waited to be read. Vanessa swept in at 10:10, bringing the scent of expensive perfume and the energy of someone who billed by the quarter hour. Maserati keys in hand, Hermes briefcase that Emma recognized from a magazine article about Vanessa making partner at Crawford and Associates. She wore a Cartier watch to their grandmother's funeral. Emma remembered because she had stared at it during the brief phone call where Vanessa had mentioned the service was happening but had not actually invited Emma to attend. Vanessa's eyes swept over Emma and Sophie with an assessment that took approximately 1 second. Target dress, worn shoes, the unmistakable markers of struggle visible to anyone who knew how to look. Something flickered in her expression. It might have been pity. It might have been satisfaction. Either way, it made Emma's skin crawl. Shall we begin? Patterson's voice carried the gentle firmness of a man trying to keep this professional. Brandon set his phone face down on the table with visible reluctance. Vanessa opened a leather notepad and clicked a pen that probably cost more than Emma's grocery budget for the month. Both of them looked at Patterson with the focused attention of people waiting to learn how much richer they were about to become. Patterson cleared his throat and began reading in the flat, legal tone that made even death sound like a contract negotiation. Grace Elizabeth Sullivan, being of sound mind and body, had executed her will on March 3rd of the previous year. There were small bequests to various charities, $15,000 to the Denver Art Initiative, $5,000 to the Copperfield Public Library, another $10,000 split between the local food bank and women's shelter. Brandon shifted impatiently. Vanessa made a note. Emma felt Sophie press closer against her side, seeking warmth and comfort in a room that offered neither. To my grandson, Brandon Sullivan, I leave the property located at 2847 Cherry Hills Drive, including all structures, furnishings, and landscaping. Brandon nodded once. Emma knew that address, the lakefront house, probably worth $1.4 million at current market rates, maybe more. Brandon's expression did not change. He had expected this. He had probably already calculated how it would affect his portfolio. To my granddaughter, Vanessa Sullivan Morrison, I leave my complete collection of antique jade pieces, professionally appraised at $950,000, as well as my vintage jewelry collection, appraised at $180,000. Vanessa made another note. Efficient, clinical, like she was tallying up a business deal not receiving her grandmother's estate. The pen moved across her notepad with the practiced ease of someone who documented everything, trusted nothing, and kept score in ways that had nothing to do with sentiment. Patterson paused. His eyes found Emma's with something that looked like apology, like he knew what was coming and wished he could soften it somehow, but also knew that softening was not his job. To my granddaughter, Emma Sullivan, I leave the sum of $5 in cash in the original mountain homestead located at Copper Ridge, Colorado. GPS coordinates and property deed to be provided separately. The silence that followed had weight and shape. It pressed down on the conference room like a physical thing, filling every corner, pushing the air out of Emma's lungs. She felt it in her chest, in her throat, in the sudden heat rising to her face as the words settled into comprehension. $5. A mountain cabin that nobody had lived in for 40 years. That was her inheritance. That was what her grandmother had left her, while her siblings received millions. Then Brandon laughed. It was not a chuckle or a quiet expression of disbelief. It was a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the conference room walls and seemed to go on forever. His head tilted back. His shoulders shook. The sound of it made Emma's vision narrow to pinpoints, made her hands clench into fists under the table, made every muscle in her body tense with the effort of not screaming. $5? Brandon could barely get the words out through his laughter. $5? That is it? Vanessa was not laughing, but her lips had curved into something that was not quite a smile, more like satisfaction at being proven right about something she had always suspected, the old mountain shack. She shook her head slowly, almost pitying. That place has not been occupied in 40 years. The structure is probably condemned by now. Brandon was still laughing, wiping his eyes with one hand while the other stayed flat on the table, fingers spread wide on the polished wood. Emma, I am sorry, but this is almost funny. He did not sound sorry. He sounded delighted. $5. I spend more than that on coffee. Vanessa's voice cut through with surgical precision, though perhaps proportional to life contributions. Brandon built a $50 million tech company. I made partner at Crawford. You draw pictures with teenagers for $37,000 a year. The words landed like physical blows, each one a separate impact, each one designed to wound. Emma's hands clenched harder under the table, but she kept her face still. 7 months sleeping in a car had taught her how to take hits without flinching, how to let cruelty wash over her without giving the satisfaction of a reaction, how to sit in rooms where she was not wanted and pretend that the hatred directed at her did not reach the soft places she had learned to hide. Sophie's hand squeezed harder. Emma squeezed back. "We are okay," the pressure said. "We have survived worse than this." Patterson cleared his throat again. Mrs. Sullivan left specific instructions regarding the mountain property. He looked at Emma with something that might have been encouragement or might have been professional obligation. She requested that Emma visit the site personally before making any decisions about disposition. Disposition means getting rid of it. Vanessa's tone suggested she was explaining something to a slow child. In case legal terminology is unfamiliar, Marcus leaned back in his chair, still grinning. What is there to decide? The place is worthless. Not even worth the property taxes you would have to pay to keep it. Actually, he paused, savoring the moment. You will have to pay to keep it. Actually, the property taxes are current and paid through the end of the year. Patterson's voice carried a hint of steel that had not been there before, and there are no liens or encumbrances. The 40 acres are fully yours, Miss Sullivan. 40 acres of rocks and a collapsing cabin. Brandon shook his head, still smiling. Congratulations, little sister. You are officially a slumlord. Vanessa gathered her papers with efficient movements, sliding them into her Hermes briefcase with the smooth practice of someone who had done this 1,000 times. When you are ready to dispose of it, Brandon knows contractors who can handle the demolition and land sale. She looked at Emma with an expression that was almost kind, which made it worse. Consider it a family favor. She stood. Brandon followed. Both of them preparing to leave to return to their important lives and expensive cars and the comfortable knowledge that they had gotten what they deserved. What they had earned through building empires and making partner and not wasting their time teaching art to ungrateful teenagers. At the door, Brandon paused and turned back. His grin had faded into something that might have been genuine concern if Emma had not known him better, if she had not remembered the phone call 6 months ago, the dismissal, the refusal, the complete unwillingness to spend $2,000 on his homeless sister and niece. Seriously, Emma, call me when you are ready to dump it. I will make sure you get at least enough to cover the hassle. Then they were gone. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid. Like an ending. Like the final period at the end of a sentence that had been writing itself for years. Emma sat in the sudden silence, staring at her hands folded on the table, breathing carefully through the rage and humiliation and the small, stupid part of her that had hoped for something different, that had imagined maybe this time, maybe finally. Maybe her grandmother had left her something that would change everything. An apartment deposit, a few months of breathing room, a chance to give Sophie a bedroom with a door that locked. Instead, she had $5 in a shack that her siblings had just spent 10 minutes laughing about. Patterson pushed a thick manila envelope across the table. Inside, you will find the property deed, GPS coordinates, keys to the structure, and a personal letter from your grandmother. Emma took the envelope with numb fingers. It was heavier than she had expected, thick with documents and something else, something hard and small at the bottom that she could not identify through the paper. I should tell you, Patterson continued, his voice gentler now that they were alone. Your grandmother spoke very highly of you in our meetings. Very highly. He paused. She was quite clear that you were to receive the mountain property specifically because, and I quote, Emma will understand when the time is right. What is there to understand? The words came out harder than Emma intended, sharp with bitterness she had meant to hide. It is a worthless shack. My siblings are right to laugh at it. Patterson studied her for a long moment. His eyes were kind in a way that made Emma want to cry. Kind in a way that acknowledged she was struggling without requiring her to admit it out loud. Your grandmother was many things, Miss Sullivan, but she was not cruel and she was not foolish. If she left you this property, she had reasons. He stood and gathered his papers. Take your time. The room is yours for as long as you need. When he left, Emma finally let herself feel it. Not tears. She had run out of those somewhere around month 3 of sleeping in her car. Just a hollow ache that started in her chest and spread outward until her entire body felt empty. Carved out, like someone had reached inside her and removed everything that made her herself, leaving only a shell that knew how to go through the motions. Sophie shifted in her seat. Mom, I know, baby. Uncle Brandon was mean. He was. Sophie's voice was small but certain, and Aunt Vanessa too. Yeah, she was. Sophie pulled the manila envelope closer and opened it carefully. Her small fingers worked the clasp with practiced efficiency, the same efficiency she brought to everything now. To folding coats for blankets, to washing her hair in gym sinks, to pretending she did not mind sleeping in a car night after night. Inside the envelope was a smaller box, geared leather with tarnished brass clasps. Sophie opened it and gasped. "Mom, look!" Grace's jade bracelet, the one Emma had admired every time she visited her grandmother. The one Vanessa had probably assumed would be part of her jade collection. It was simple and beautiful. The green stone, worn smooth by decades of wear, polished by the skin of a woman who had worn it every day for longer than Emma had been alive. Emma lifted it out with shaking hands. Inside the band, engraved in delicate script that she had never noticed before, "To Grace for keeping promises." 1967. "Grandma knew," Sophie said softly. "She knew what you would need." That night, Emma sat in the driver's seat of the Honda while Sophie slept in the back. They had driven halfway home before exhaustion forced them to stop, pulling into another Walmart parking lot that looked exactly like every other Walmart parking lot they had slept in over the past 7 months. The same sodium lights, the same delivery trucks, the same careful calculation of which spots were least likely to attract attention. She finally opened the letter Patterson had mentioned. Grace's handwriting covered 3 pages. Careful script that spoke of time taken, of words considered, of someone who had known these sentences needed to last longer than she would. "My dearest Emma," it began. They laughed, did they not? Emma pressed her hand to her mouth. Tears she had not known she still had left began to fall, silent and hot against her fingers. "Brandon and Vanessa, I knew they would. That is why I am trusting you, not them. The mountain property is not what it seems. Your great-great-grandmother, Sarah Blackwood, built that homestead in 1867. She was half Irish, half Ute, rejected by both worlds. But she survived. She thrived. And she hid something there, something I have protected for 45 years, waiting for the right person. Not the richest person, not the most successful, the right person. You, Emma, you have been tested by life in ways they never have. Homeless, divorced, broke. But you still protect Sophie's joy. Still teach beauty to ungrateful teenagers. Still believe in goodness when the world gives you every reason not to. That is rare, that is strong. Go to the cabin, northeast corner, loose floorboard. Look for the trap door. The combination is 1867, the year Sarah built her home. What is below will change everything. But Emma, listen carefully. How you use it will define who you are. This is not just money, it is a 150-year promise that Sarah made. I have kept it. Now I am passing it to you. Trust yourself. You survived homelessness with grace. You can handle this. I love you. I have always been proudest of you. At the bottom of the envelope, wrapped in tissue paper thin with age, was a pocket watch. Gold. Heavy. Ornate in a way that suggested it had been valuable once and might be valuable still. Emma turned it over and found an inscription. To Sarah, time reveals all truths, 1867. The watch still ticked, perfect rhythm, keeping time after more than a century and a half. Emma held it to her ear and listened to the steady beat, the mechanical heart of something that had outlasted everyone who had ever held it before. And for the first time in months, she let herself imagine that maybe tomorrow would be different from today. Maybe the $5 inheritance was not the end of the story. Maybe it was only the beginning. Emma read the letter 3 more times before the words stopped blurring together. Each reading revealed something new, some phrase or detail she had missed, while her mind was still reeling from the shock of being laughed at by her own siblings. By the time she finished the 3rd reading, Sophie had woken up and was watching her from the back seat with those 2 old eyes that saw everything. What does it say, Mom? Emma folded the pages carefully, handling them like the precious things they were. Your great-great-grandmother built that cabin. In 1867, she hid something there, something Grandma Grace has been protecting for 45 years. Sophie processed this with the seriousness of a child who had learned that adult problems required adult attention. What kind of something? I do not know yet, but Grandma says it will change everything. The silence that followed was heavy with questions neither of them could answer. Outside the Honda's frosted windows, the Walmart parking lot was waking up. Early morning shoppers walked past without glancing at the car, where a mother and daughter sat contemplating a mystery that spanned 5 generations. Emma looked at the letter again, at the precise instructions Grace had left. Northeast corner, loose floorboard, trap door, combination 1867. The words read like a treasure map, like something from one of the adventure novels Sophie used to check out from the library before they lost their address in their library card along with everything else. We need to go there. Emma's voice surprised her with its certainty. To the cabin. We need to see what she left. When? Friday. After school lets out for the weekend, we can drive up and be there before dark. The plan formed as she spoke, taking shape from desperation and hope and the absolute lack of any better option. She would cash her paycheck Friday afternoon. She would buy the supplies they needed. She would drive 3 hours into the mountains with her daughter and find whatever Sarah Blackwood had hidden 158 years ago. And maybe, if Grace was right, everything would change. Friday arrived with the grinding slowness of days that hold too much anticipation. Emma taught her classes with half her mind on value scales and shading techniques, and the other half calculating distances and costs and the precise amount of gas she would need to reach Copper Ridge without stranding them in the middle of nowhere. Her paycheck hit her account at $215. $2,180, the same amount as always, the same inadequate sum that had to stretch across 30 days of survival. But this time the math was different. This time she was not just calculating how to exist. She was calculating how to find something that might end the calculation entirely. 900 to storage, 420 to insurance, 250 to credit cards. That left $610 and she needed 120 of that for this trip. Gas to get there and back, food that would not spoil, basic supplies for exploring a structure that had been abandoned for 4 decades. She drove to Walmart one more time, but this time she walked through the aisles as a customer rather than someone who had spent the previous night sleeping in the parking lot. The familiar fluorescent lights looked different somehow. Less like prison bars and more like runway markers, guiding her towards something she could not yet name. 2 heavy-duty flashlights with extra batteries. 100 feet of climbing rope rated for 500 pounds. Waterproof matches. Emergency blankets that folded down to nothing but could mean the difference between freezing and surviving. A first aid kit. Protein bars and peanut butter and bread and apples. Bottled water. The total came to $99.34. Emma stared at the receipt and did the mental math that had become as automatic as breathing. $510 left for 28 days. $18.21 per day for everything. Gas, food, phone bill. The endless small expenses that accumulated like snow until you were buried. But maybe after this weekend, the math would not matter anymore. Sophie watched her mother load the supplies into the Honda's trunk, cramming them between the plastic bins that held their entire lives. She did not ask the question that hovered unspoken between them. What happens if there is nothing there? What happens if Grandma Grace was confused at the end? If the letter was wishful thinking from a dying woman? If the cabin holds nothing but dust and disappointment? Neither of them could afford to ask that question out loud. The drive began at 4:30, right after Emma picked Sophie up from the after-school program. They left the Denver suburbs behind and headed west, climbing into mountains that still held snow and shadowed places where the late February sun could not reach. The Honda's engine whined on steep grades, protesting the altitude and the cold and the accumulated neglect of years without proper maintenance. The heater worked intermittently, 10 minutes of blessed warmth followed by 20 minutes of nothing but cold air that smelled of antifreeze and age. Emma wrapped Sophie in 2 coats and kept driving, hands tight on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road that curved upward through pine forests and rocky outcroppings. Sophie did homework by the dome light, practicing long division in a notebook balanced on her knees. The pencil scratched against paper with a rhythm that filled the silence, providing something to focus on besides the uncertainty ahead. Between problems, she asked questions. Mom, can butterflies fly in the rain? I think so, baby. Their wings are waterproof. What about really heavy rain? Then they probably find shelter. Hide under leaves until it stops. Like us hiding in the car? Emma's hands tightened on the wheel. Something in her chest clenched at the casual comparison, at how naturally her daughter connected butterfly survival strategies to their own precarious existence. Sort of like that, yeah. More long division, more pencil scratching, more miles of mountain road unwinding beneath their wheels. Then another question, this one carrying weight that had nothing to do with butterflies. "Mom, why does Uncle Brandon not like us?" Emma took a breath. She had known this question was coming, had been dreading it since the moment Brandon laughed in that conference room, his amusement echoing off the walls while Sophie sat silent and small beside her. It is not about not liking. She chose her words carefully, trying to explain something she barely understood herself. Uncle Brandon and Aunt Vanessa measure things differently than we do. They think success means money and big houses and expensive cars. They think people who have those things are worth more than people who do not. But that is not true. No, it is not true. Emma glanced in the rearview mirror at her daughter's face, serious and thoughtful in the dim light. Some people measure worth by what you own. Other people measure it by who you are, by how you treat people, by whether you keep your promises and help others when they need it. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made Emma's eyes sting with tears she could not afford to shed while driving mountain roads at night. "I think Grandma Grace measured worth like us. That is why she gave you the cabin instead of them." The check engine light came on somewhere past the town of Fairplay. Emma watched the orange glow appear on the dashboard and added it to the long list of things she could not afford to fix. The car struggled on steep grades, engine whining in protest, transmission hesitating before finding the right gear. She pressed the accelerator and made silent bargains with whatever forces might be listening. "Just get us there. Hold together until we see what is waiting. Give us this one chance and I will figure out the rest later." The GPS died 20 miles from their destination. Signal lost to mountain terrain, the screen showing nothing but a gray void where directions should have been. Emma pulled over and consulted the paper map from Grace's envelope, squinting at the faded lines in the dome light while Sophie held the flashlight steady. A narrow dirt road branched from the main highway, marked by a wooden post so weathered that the words carved into it were barely legible. Copper Ridge Trail. Below that, nearly invisible. Four-wheel drive recommended. Emma looked at her two-wheel drive Honda with its check engine light and balding tires. She looked at the dirt road disappearing into darkness between towering pines. She looked at her daughter, who was watching her with absolute faith that whatever decision she made would be the right one. "We have come this far." They turned onto the dirt road. The next 15 minutes tested every ounce of faith Emma had in the aging Honda. The road was more ruts than surface, carved by years of runoff and neglect. Rocks scraped the undercarriage with sounds that made Emma wince. Branches whipped against the windows like fingers trying to push them back. The headlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, the darkness beyond absolute and complete. The car bounced and struggled and somehow kept going. Sophie gripped the door handle and did not complain. Emma gripped the steering wheel and did not let herself think about what would happen if they got stuck out here, miles from anywhere, with no cell signal and no one expecting them. Then the road opened into a clearing, and Emma's foot hit the brake hard enough that Sophie lurched forward against her seatbelt. The cabin sat 50 feet ahead, caught in the headlights like a ghost reluctantly revealed. It was smaller than Emma had imagined, maybe 20 feet square, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray over a century and a half of mountain seasons. The roof sagged on the left side, several shingles missing, creating gaps that looked like missing teeth in an ancient face. The front porch had partially collapsed. One corner touched the ground at an angle that suggested complete structural failure was not far off. Windows gaped dark and empty, no glass remaining, just rectangular holes that stared at them like eyes that had forgotten how to close. But it was the setting that stole Emma's breath. The cabin had been built directly against a cliff face, granite wall rising 100 feet straight up, creating a natural barrier that made the property feel both protected and trapped. Pine trees surrounded the clearing, their branches heavy with old snow that had not yet melted in the late winter cold. In the headlights, shadows pooled between the trunks like dark water, deep and impenetrable. "It is like a witch's house," Sophie's whisper broke the silence. Then, after a pause that lasted 3 heartbeats, "But a good witch, like Grandma was good." Emma parked 20 feet from the cabin and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was profound. No traffic sounds, no city hum, just wind through pine branches and the settling sounds of the Honda's engine cooling and their own breathing, suddenly loud in the absence of everything else. They sat without moving, staring at the structure that represented either their salvation or the final confirmation that they were alone in the world with nothing and no one to save them. Emma's phone buzzed. One bar of signal, flickering in and out like a candle fighting the wind. A text message appeared, and when Emma read it, something cold settled in her stomach. Lawsuit filed. Monday 9 a.m. hearing, hope you are ready. From Brandon. Of course. Even here, 3 hours from Denver, surrounded by mountains and darkness, he could reach her with his cruelty. She stared at the words until they stopped making sense. Then she turned the phone face down and looked at her daughter. We will sleep in the car tonight. In the morning, we will see what is inside. Sophie nodded and began the familiar routine of arranging coats for blankets. Emma reclined her seat and stared through the windshield at the cabin's dark shape against the darker cliff. Somewhere in Denver, Brandon was probably in his penthouse drinking expensive scotch, confident that Monday's hearing would overturn Grace's crazy will and divide the property properly among people who actually deserved it. Vanessa was probably reviewing legal strategies, already planning how to take everything Emma had been given. And Emma was here, in a car that might not start tomorrow, with her 9-year-old daughter, holding a letter from a dead grandmother who had promised that everything would change. The cabin's empty windows stared back at her, giving nothing away. The door hung crooked on its hinges, partly open, revealing nothing but shadow. Whatever secret Sarah Blackwood had hidden here, they would have to wait until morning. Emma closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to Grace's words. Northeast corner, loose floorboard, trap door. What is below will change everything. Around midnight, she heard it. The sound came from the direction of the cabin. Glass breaking, or maybe a branch falling, or maybe something else entirely. Something that moved with purpose through the darkness. Emma sat up slowly, heart pounding. She peered through the windshield at the cabin, searching for movement, for any sign that they were not alone in this clearing. Nothing moved. No lights appeared. No shadows shifted where shadows should have been still. Just the cabin, dark and silent, settling into its slow decay. Probably nothing. Just an old structure, making old structure sounds. Wood contracting in the cold. A beam giving way after decades of holding position. The natural entropy of abandoned places returning to the earth that had given them birth. But the feeling stayed with her. The prickling at the back of her neck. The certainty, irrational but unshakable, that something out there in the darkness was watching. Waiting. Seeing them in ways they could not see back. Emma lay back down and pulled her coat tighter. She told herself that tomorrow everything would be different. Tomorrow they would find what Sarah Blackwood had hidden. Tomorrow their lives would change. She almost believed it. Morning came cold and bright. The kind of Colorado mountain morning that made everything sharp and clear. Details standing out with crystalline precision. Frost had painted fern patterns across the Honda's windows, transforming the world outside into abstract art. Emma woke to find Sophie already sitting up, staring at the cabin through the passenger window, with an intensity that suggested she had been watching for a while. How long have you been awake? A while. Sophie did not look away from the cabin. I was listening. Listening for what? To see if it talked. Sophie's voice carried the matter-of-fact certainty of childhood. Houses talk if you listen right. You told me that once. You said Grandma Grace taught you that old houses tell stories if you know how to hear them. The memory surfaced unbidden. Emma at Sophie's age sitting in Grace's kitchen while her grandmother explained how wood grain held time, how foundation cracks mapped decades, how every house whispered its history to those patient enough to listen. Brandon had called it hippie nonsense. Vanessa had rolled her eyes and returned to her homework. But Emma had listened, had learned, had carried that lesson into her teaching, into the way she helped teenagers see that art was not about making pretty pictures, but about paying attention to what the world was trying to say. Let us go hear what this one has to say. They approached the cabin with the caution of people who had learned that structures could betray you. Emma tested each porch board before committing her weight. The wood groaned beneath her feet, protesting the intrusion, but it held. 3 of the boards were soft with rot, flexing under pressure in ways that warned of imminent collapse. She marked them mentally and stepped over, guiding Sophie to do the same. The door required force. Decades of weather had swollen the wood, jamming it against a frame that had warped and shifted over the years. Emma pushed with her shoulder, felt the resistance, pushed harder. The door scraped against the floor with a sound like fingernails on wood. The hinges shrieked. Then they were inside. The smell hit first. Decades of dust, thick enough to coat the back of Emma's throat. Mouse droppings in the corners, old wood releasing the faint tang of resin, sap that had dried a century ago still giving off ghost scents when disturbed. And underneath all of that, something else. Something mineral and cold that seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. One room, 20 feet by 20 feet, maybe less. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the far corner, rust eating through cast iron like disease through flesh. A table leaned against the wall, one leg snapped clean through. Shelves lined the eastern side, empty, except for tin cups that had oxidized to tarnished green. An alcove extended to the north, just large enough for sleeping. Light filtered through gaps in the roof, creating columns of illuminated dust that moved with their breathing. Every surface wore gray film, undisturbed except where their feet now left prints. Emma ran her finger across the table's surface, leaving a trail through decades of accumulation. Someone lived here once. Her voice came out hushed, reverent. Someone made this home. Sophie moved through the space like a detective at a crime scene, examining everything, missing nothing. She stopped near the alcove and crouched down, her small body folding with the flexibility of youth. "Mom, look!" Emma crossed to where her daughter knelt. Sophie was pointing at the floor, at a pattern in the dust that told his own story. Near the door, where weather had found entry through gaps in the walls, the dust coating was thicker. Years of accumulation building layer on layer, but in the protected corner of the alcove, the layer was thinner. And in one spot, maybe a foot square, there was no dust at all, just clean wood, as if something had rested there recently and been removed. Someone was here. Sophie's voice carried certainty that had nothing to do with guessing. Not long ago, someone took something. Emma knelt beside her daughter, studying the pattern with new eyes. A rectangular outline in the dust, maybe a foot long, 6 inches wide. Something box-shaped had sat here, protected from the elements, until recently removed. Or someone took it. Sophie looked up at her mother with eyes that understood too much. Someone else knows about this place. Emma did not answer because she did not have an answer that would not frighten her daughter more. Instead, she stood and began a systematic examination of the cabin. The walls were solid, the timbers aged but not rotted through. The stove was beyond salvage, but its presence suggested the cabin had been functional once, lived in, heated against mountain cold that could kill the unprepared. The alcove showed signs of careful construction, logs fitted with precision that spoke of skill. Whoever built this place had known what they were doing. In the shelves, she found nothing but those tin cups and the dried corpse of a mouse that had died decades ago. The table's broken leg showed a clean break, recent enough that the exposed wood had not weathered. Emma lifted the table and found something that made her breath catch. Initials carved into the underside, SB 1867. Sarah Blackwood, great-great-grandmother. The woman who had built this place with her own hands when she was younger than Emma was now. Irish and Ute, rejected by both worlds according to Grace's letter. But she had survived. She had made something from nothing. She had hidden secrets that lasted 158 years. Emma traced the carved letters with her fingertip and felt something shift in her chest. Connection across 5 generations. Blood calling to blood across a century and a half. "Mom, come here." Sophie had moved to the alcove and now stood very still, head tilted at an angle that suggested intense focus. Her foot rested on one of the floorboards. "This board moved when I stepped on it." Emma crossed the room in 3 steps. She knelt and pressed her hand to the floorboard in question. It shifted. Not much, but enough. The nails had been pulled and replaced often enough that the wood had lost its grip. Heart pounding, Emma worked her fingers into the gap between boards. The wood was cold against her skin, rough with age and exposure. She pulled. The board came up easily. Beneath it, more boards ran perpendicular, creating a secondary layer. And wedged between them, partially visible in the shadows, was a metal tin about the size of a shoebox. Emma's hands were steady as she freed it from its hiding place. The tin was old but intact, sealed against moisture by a layer of wax that cracked as she pried the lid open. Inside, wrapped in wax paper yellowed with age, were 3 photographs and a handwritten note. The first photograph showed a woman standing in front of this cabin. Not young, maybe 40 or 50, with features that marked her as exactly what Grace had described in the letter. High cheekbones that spoke of native heritage, eyes that held a hint of Ireland, skin weathered by sun and wind, and a life lived outdoors. She wore work clothes and held herself with the posture of someone who had learned to claim space despite the world's resistance. On the back, in faded ink that had somehow survived 150 years, Sarah Blackwood, 1867. The second photograph showed the same woman, older now, maybe 60. She stood in the same spot, but this time she held something in her hands. Something small and rectangular that the photograph's age had rendered too blurry to identify. The third photograph made Emma's breath catch. A young Grace, maybe 30 years old, standing in this cabin, in this very room, smiling at the camera with determination that Emma recognized from her own mirror. The same set of the jaw, the same defiance in the eyes. On the back, Grace Sullivan, 1974. The note was written in handwriting that must have been Sarah's. The paper was fragile enough that Emma handled it like prayer, terrified that it might crumble before she could read what it said. For daughters of my blood who come after. Look beneath where I rest my head. The mountain keeps promises. Emma read it twice, 3 times, making sure she understood. She looked at Sophie, who had leaned close enough that her hair brushed Emma's cheek. She looks like us. Sophie touched Sarah's image with one careful finger. Same eyes. Emma saw it too. The shape of Sophie's face echoed in Sarah's bones. The set of Emma's jaw mirrored in how Sarah held her head. 5 generations of blood still carried forward, visible and undeniable. Beneath where I rest my head. Emma looked toward the alcove, the sleeping area, northeast corner. They moved together, mother and daughter, to the far corner of the alcove. Emma examined the floorboards with new attention. One board was slightly different from the others, newer wood or at least more recently placed. She pressed down, it gave. This one. She pulled and the board came free. Beneath it were 2 more boards, smaller, creating a compartment that had been invisible until now. She removed those and revealed what lay underneath. A wooden hatch, 3 feet square, fitted so perfectly into the subfloor that it had been invisible until exposed. An iron ring handle set into the wood, and beside it, built into the hatch itself, a combination lock. 3 rotating dials, numbers 0 through 9 on each. Sophie's voice came out, barely above a whisper. The trap door. Emma pulled Grace's letter from her pocket with hands that trembled, despite her efforts at control. 1867, the year Sarah built her home. The year that kept appearing over and over, marking everything important. She set the first dial to 1, the second to 8, the third to 6, the fourth to 7. Her fingers found the iron ring, cold metal against her skin. She pulled. The lock clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo forever in the small cabin. A mechanical surrender after decades of holding fast. Emma lifted the hatch slowly, fighting hinges that groaned after 40 years without movement. Cool air rushed up from below, carrying the smell of deep earth and minerals and something else. Something that suggested vast spaces hidden beneath their feet. Caves, tunnels, the hollow bones of the mountain itself. Emma pulled the heavy-duty flashlight from her backpack and aimed it into the darkness below. The beam revealed wooden ladder rungs descending into shadow. She could see the first 10 or 12 rungs, worn smooth by hands that had climbed up and down for years, decades, generations. Beyond that, the light could not penetrate, just darkness, so complete it seemed solid. What is down there? I do not know, but Grandma knew, and Sarah knew before her. Are we going down? Emma looked at the ladder, at the darkness, at her 9-year-old daughter whose life had already asked too much courage from her. Not yet. First we make sure it is safe. We need more supplies, and we need someone who knows about this kind of thing. The drive to Copperfield took 40 minutes on roads that deteriorated from paved to dirt to barely visible tracks through mountain meadows. The town appeared suddenly, tucked into a valley between peaks that rose on either side like giants keeping watch. Population sign promising 412 residents. 1 main street, a gas station that looked like it had not been updated since the Reagan administration. A diner with 3 pickup trucks parked outside, and at the end of the street, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign. Betty's General Store, established 1956. The bell over the door chimed as Emma entered. The interior smelled of coffee and old wood and something baking in the back. Shelves packed tight with everything from canned goods to fishing tackle to what appeared to be veterinary supplies. A place that served a community too far from civilization to afford specialization. The woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle. She studied Emma with eyes that had spent 7 decades reading people. White hair pulled back in a bun, face weathered by mountain sun and wind, hands that moved with the efficiency of someone who had spent a lifetime stocking shelves and making change. Help you? I need supplies, flashlights, rope, camping gear. The woman came around the counter with surprising agility for her age. She moved toward the back shelves with purpose, clearly knowing exactly where everything lived. Camping up in the mountains. Getting late in the season for that. Weather can turn quick this high up. Just for a day or two, nothing extensive. The woman gathered items as Emma listed them. 2 more heavy-duty flashlights, more batteries, waterproof matches, emergency blankets, a first aid kit that looked military surplus. She moved through the store like someone who had arranged every item herself and remembered where each one lived after 40 years of practice. "You are not from around here." "No," Emma hesitated, then made a decision. "But my grandmother owned property nearby, the old Blackwood place, up on Copper Ridge." The crossword puzzle was forgotten. The woman stopped moving and turned to face Emma directly. Her eyes had sharpened with interest that went beyond simple curiosity. "The Blackwood place. What was your grandmother's name?" "Grace Sullivan." The woman's expression changed. Something flickered across her features. Recognition, memory, perhaps grief for someone recently lost. "Grace Sullivan. Well, I will be. You are her granddaughter." "I am." Emma found herself straightening under the woman's gaze. "I am Emma. This is my daughter, Sophie. Betty Campbell. I run this place." The woman's handshake was dry and strong. "Knew your grandmother 40 years, maybe more. Heard she passed. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Betty rang up the supplies with practiced efficiency, but her attention stayed on Emma's face, reading things that probably showed more clearly than Emma wanted them to. "Rose used to come through here every few months, regular as clockwork, buy supplies, head up to that mountain property of hers, stay for weeks sometimes." "Do you know what she was doing up there?" Betty leaned against the counter. Her eyes were sharp and assessing. "Never asked. Figured it was not my business. But I will tell you what I noticed." She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone who understood that some information carried weight. "She bought specific things. Survey equipment sometimes. Rock hammers, those heavy lanterns that miners use." Emma felt her pulse quicken. The word miners hung in the air between them. "Did anyone ever go with her?" "Not that I saw, always solo." Betty paused again, then made a decision. "You know there is a geologist lives in town, retired professor from Colorado School of Mines. Margaret Hayes, blue house on Maple, 2 blocks north." "Why are you telling me this?" Betty's smile carried knowledge she was not sharing directly. "Because Rose was private about what she was doing, but she was not secretive with people she trusted. She brought Margaret rock samples sometimes." The smile widened slightly. "And if you are here asking about supplies for that property, you are probably about to need someone who understands rocks." The blue house on Maple stood behind a garden that looked like a geological museum. Specimens arranged on low walls, labeled rock formations creating borders between flower beds. Even the stepping stones were chosen for their fossil content, ancient creatures pressed into stone and preserved across millions of years. Emma knocked and waited. Sophie stood beside her, both of them dusty from the cabin and uncertain about involving anyone else in whatever Grace had left them. The woman who opened the door was tall and slightly stooped with age. White hair fell wild around a face that suggested decades spent outdoors, studying things most people walk past without seeing. Thick glasses magnified blue eyes that fastened on Emma with immediate focus. "Yes?" "Dr. Hayes? Betty Campbell suggested I talk to you. I am Emma Sullivan, Grace Sullivan's granddaughter." The change was immediate. Margaret Hayes straightened, glasses slipping down her nose in her surprise. "Sullivan, Grace Sullivan's granddaughter. Come in, please." The house's interior had been converted into a workspace that would make any geologist weep. Shelves lined every wall, packed with labeled specimens. A massive desk held microscopes and testing equipment. Geological maps covered available wall space. Colorado's underground rendered in careful detail, secrets of the earth laid bare for those who knew how to read them. Margaret cleared papers from 2 chairs and gestured for Emma and Sophie to sit. Then she opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a folder labeled in neat script. "Sullivan, confidential. Rose came to me 15 years ago." Margaret's voice was soft with memory. "Brought rock samples. Asked me to analyze them quietly. No official reports, no paperwork that could be traced." Emma felt her heart begin to pound. "What did you find?" Margaret opened the folder, revealing photographs and typed reports. Close-up images of rock samples. The stone shot through with gleaming veins that caught light like captured stars. "Wire silver." Margaret said the words like a prayer. "Museum-quality specimens. The formation is exceptional. Purity remarkable. She watched Emma's face as she continued. Conservative estimate for just the samples Rose brought me, $4 to $6 million. The room tilted. Emma gripped the chair arms and tried to process numbers that did not fit in any mental category she had available. $4 to $6 million, more money than she would make in 100 years of teaching, more than enough to change everything. Margaret was not finished. But that is just samples. If there is a vein, an actual producing vein of this quality extending into the mountain, we are talking about 18 to 25 million, maybe more. Sophie made a sound, half gasp, half whimper. Emma pulled her close and tried to breathe through the shock. Why did my grandmother not mine it? Margaret's expression softened. She said it was not about the money. She mentioned indigenous heritage, sacred sites, a promise someone had made a long time ago. She was negotiating some kind of agreement, said when the time was right, someone in her family would honor it. The older woman leaned forward, studying Emma with the same intensity she probably used on geological formations. I am guessing that someone is you. I do not know yet. Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt. I do not even know if what she left me contains any of this. I found a trap door under the cabin floor. I have not been down yet. Margaret stood and began gathering equipment from shelves and cabinets. Flashlights, testing equipment, a hard hat with a lamp attached. I would like to visit the site, do a proper assessment. She turned to face Emma directly. But I need to be clear about something. I am 74 years old. I have more money than I need and more years behind me than ahead. I am not interested in exploiting your discovery. She met Emma's eyes with a gaze that demanded honesty. I just want to see a genuine find one more time before I die. Would that be acceptable? Emma felt the weight of decision pressing down. Involving someone else meant risk, meant trusting, meant exposing whatever lay under that cabin to another person's knowledge and judgment. But it also meant expertise, confirmation, someone who could tell her if the dreams Grace had planted were real or just the confused hopes of a dying woman trying to make meaning of a worthless inheritance. Yes, thank you. Margaret nodded and continued packing equipment into a worn leather bag. Your brother is threatening to contest the will. Her voice was casual, but her eyes were sharp. Betty mentioned she heard you got a text, filing Monday. How did Betty know about that? Small town. Margaret shrugged. Barry shrugged. Word travels, especially about Sullivan family business. Emma pulled out her phone and looked at Brandon's text again. Lawsuit filed, Monday 9 a.m. hearing. Hope you are ready. Then you need a lawyer. There is an attorney here, Thomas Brooks. He handles mineral rights cases. I will call him. I do not have money for a lawyer. Margaret picked up her phone and began dialing. Let me talk to Tom. He is a good man. He will work something out. They loaded equipment into Margaret's battered pickup truck. Emma's Honda followed as they drove back toward Copper Ridge, climbing mountain roads as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The supplies rattled in the truck bed. The rope, the flashlights, the testing equipment that would tell them whether Grace's promise was real. Sophie sat beside Emma, quiet and thoughtful. Her notebook open on her lap, but she was not doing homework. She was writing something else. When Emma glanced over, she saw her daughter had drawn the cabin. Not accurately, but emotionally. The sagging roof, the dark windows, the cliff face rising behind. And beneath the cabin, drawn with careful attention to detail, a tunnel leading down into darkness where something waited. At the bottom of the page, in Sophie's careful handwriting, what Grandma left us. They reached the cabin as shadows began to lengthen across the clearing. Margaret's truck parked beside the Honda. The three of them walked to the cabin together. The older woman moved with purpose that suggested she had been waiting for this moment for 15 years. Inside, the trap door waited where Emma had left it, open, revealing the ladder descending into darkness. Margaret knelt at the edge and shined her flashlight into the depths. The beam revealed the ladder, the first dozen rungs worn smooth by decades of use. Beyond that, darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. This goes deep, at least 30 feet, possibly more. Margaret looked up at Emma, then at Sophie. She did not ask if they were ready. She could see that they were. Then let us see what Sarah Blackwood was protecting. Emma secured the rope around a roof beam that looked solid enough to hold weight. She tested the first ladder rung. It held. The second, the third. Each step required faith that a 150-year-old ladder would not snap and send her plummeting into whatever waited below. I will go first. You wait here. Sophie shook her head. The motion was small but definite. We go together. Her voice carried determination that had been forged in 7 months of sleeping in parking lots and pretending everything was fine. Baby, I need to make sure it is safe. We go together. Sophie's eyes met her mother's. We are a team, Mom, remember? Emma looked at her daughter, 9 years old, small and brave and stubborn in ways that reminded her of Grace, of Sarah, of every woman in their family who had faced impossible circumstances and refused to break. She clipped a flashlight to Sophie's belt. She adjusted the straps on the child-sized climbing harness Margaret had produced from her equipment bag. She checked the rope twice, 3 times, making sure it would hold. Slowly, test every rung. If anything feels wrong, we come back up. Okay. Emma took a breath. She looked at the trap door, at the darkness below, at her daughter standing beside her ready to descend into the unknown. Then she stepped onto the first rung and began to climb down into the secret Sarah Blackwood had kept for 158 years. The descent took forever. Each rung brought Emma deeper into darkness that seemed to press against her skin like cold water. She counted as she climbed. 10 rungs, 20, 30. The air grew colder with each step, the smell of minerals intensifying until she could taste it on her tongue. Metal and earth and the ancient breath of mountains. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. Each drop echoed through spaces she could not yet see, suggesting chambers and passages that extended far beyond the reach of her flashlight beam. The sound was rhythmic, constant, like a heartbeat belonging to the mountain itself. At 35 rungs, her feet touched solid stone. Emma unclipped from the safety line and helped Sophie down the last few steps. Her daughter's face was pale in the flashlight glow, but her eyes were bright with something that looked like wonder rather than fear. They stood together in a space that felt vast despite the darkness pressing close. Emma swept her flashlight in a slow arc and felt her breath catch. They were standing in a tunnel, not a natural cave formation, but something carved by human hands from living granite. Maybe 7 feet high, 5 feet wide. The walls showed the marks of tools, pick and chisel scars that had been smoothed by time but never erased. Timber beams supported the ceiling at regular intervals, installed with the care of someone who understood that mountains could kill you if you did not respect them. The floor had been worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, generations of feet walking this same path, polishing the stone with the friction of passing. This is not a natural cave, Emma's voice echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off walls that had held silence for 40 years. This is a mine. She called up at Margaret. I'm Margaret. Her voice carrying through the shaft to where the geologist waited at the surface. We are in a tunnel. Looks hand-carved. Very old. Margaret's response drifted down, thin with distance but clear enough to understand. Follow it carefully. Look for ore deposits. Any samples you can bring up will help with assessment. Sophie walked beside Emma as they moved deeper into the tunnel. 50 feet, 70, the passage ran straight as an arrow, the work of someone who knew exactly where they were going and what they were looking for. Then it opened into a larger chamber, and the evidence of mining work became impossible to ignore. Pick marks scored the walls in patterns that suggested systematic extraction. Someone had worked this stone methodically, carefully, removing material with the patience of years. Against one wall, wooden crates stood stacked in careful rows. 6 of them, maybe more in the shadows beyond. Emma approached the first crate with hands that wanted to tremble, but she would not let them. The lid was fitted tight, sealed against moisture and time. She worked her fingers under the edge and pulled. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had somehow survived 150 years, were chunks of rock shot through with veins that gleamed in the flashlight beam. Even with no geological knowledge, Emma could see these were different from ordinary stone. The veins had structure, crystalline formation, the kind of beauty that suggested value beyond anything she had imagined. Is this silver? Sophie touched one piece carefully, her small fingers tracing the gleaming lines. It is pretty. The second crate held mining tools, pickaxes and chisels and hammers, all hand-forged, all showing the wear of extensive use. One pickaxe handle had initials carved into the wood. S.B. Sarah Blackwood had held this tool, had swung it against stone, had extracted treasure from the mountain with her own 2 hands. The third crate was smaller than the others, constructed with more care. Inside, protected by multiple layers of oiled cloth, was a leather-bound journal. Emma lifted it out with hands that trembled, despite her efforts at control. The leather had cracked with age but remained intact. She opened to the first page and read by flashlight. Journal of Sarah Blackwood, March 1867. The entries were detailed, written in careful script that suggested education and intelligence. Sarah described her arrival in Colorado, her claim on the land, her discovery of the silver vein. The writing was matter-of-fact about hardships that would have broken most people, clinical about mining techniques that she had taught herself through trial and error and sheer stubborn refusal to fail. March 15, 1867. I have claimed this land today. $1.25 per acre. Paid in gold, I panned from the creek. The claims office did not want to process it. A half-breed woman owning property, they said. But law is law. This is mine. Emma read aloud, her voice soft in the ancient darkness. Sophie leaned close, following along, both of them traveling back through time to meet the woman whose blood they carried. April 3rd, 1867. Built the cabin with my own hands. Men from town came to watch. To mock a woman doing man's work, they said. Let them mock. By winter I will have walls. They will still be drunk in Silverton saloons. May 18th, 1867. Found the vein today. Not gold. Silver, wire silver, the assayer said. Rare formation, worth more than gold to the right buyers. I will tell no one. A half-Irish, half-Ute woman with a silver mine. They would kill me for it. The entries continued through summer. Sarah learning to extract ore safely, processing it in ways that kept the discovery hidden, building her cabin above the mine entrance, creating a home that was also a disguise. Then in August, the tone changed. August 12th through 1867. Met today with an elder of the Ute people. His name is Running Wolf. He knew I was here, knew about my mining, expected anger. Instead, he showed me kindness. Emma's voice caught as she read the next lines. He took me deeper into the mountain, showed me sacred chambers where his people performed ceremonies, places where young men came to become warriors, where ancestors left offerings. I felt ashamed standing there with my pickaxe in my greed. Sophie pressed closer against her mother's side. The flashlight beam wavered as Emma struggled to keep her voice steady. Running Wolf does not condemn my mining, says the earth gives what it gives. But he asked me to make a promise. If I profit from this silver, I will protect what his people left. Return it someday. I gave my word. It is the least I can do. The journal continued with entries about learning from Running Wolf, about finding connection with someone who understood what it meant to exist between worlds, belonging fully to neither, about hiding the sacred objects Sarah had been shown, protecting them in deeper chambers until the time was right for their return. At the back of the journal, tucked into a pocket in the binding, Emma found a hand-drawn map. It showed this chamber, marked as first chamber, main cache. 3 additional tunnels branched from this central space. East was labeled ore vein, west was labeled water source, north was labeled sacred place. A note at the bottom, written in Sarah's careful hand. The covenant is in the sacred place. Honor it or lose everything. Mom, Sophie's voice was small in the darkness. What is a covenant? A promise, a serious one. Emma looked at her daughter, at the face that carried echoes of Sarah and Grace and every woman in their line who had faced impossible choices. Sarah promised Running Wolf she would protect the sacred things his people left here. She kept that promise her whole life. Grandma Grace kept it after her. Now it is ours to keep. Even if it means we do not get the silver? Emma heard the question underneath the question. Even if it means we stay homeless. Even if it means we lose to Brandon and Vanessa. Even if it means we have nothing. The answer came without hesitation. Even then, some promises matter more than money. From somewhere deeper in the tunnels came a sound that made both of them freeze. Not the dripping water, not the settling of stone. Something else, something that moved with purpose. Footsteps. Emma grabbed Sophie and pulled her close. The flashlight beam swung wildly as she tried to locate the source of the sound. The darkness beyond seemed to shift, shadows moving where shadows should be still. Hello? Her voice echoed through the chamber, bouncing off walls that had held secrets for over a century. Is someone there? No answer. The footsteps had stopped, but the feeling remained, the absolute certainty that they were not alone down here. That something or someone was watching from the darkness, seeing them in ways they could not see back. We need to go up. Emma's voice came out steadier than she felt. Now. They moved quickly through the tunnel, Sophie's small hand gripping Emma's so tightly it hurt. The ladder seemed to take forever. Each rung an obstacle, each second stretched into hours. Emma boosted Sophie up first, watching her daughter climb toward the light filtering down from the cabin above. Then she heard it again, closer this time, footsteps approaching through the tunnel behind her. Emma did not look back. She grabbed the ladder and climbed faster than she had ever climbed anything in her life. The rungs blurred beneath her hands. Her shoulders burned, her lungs screamed for air. But she kept climbing until she burst through the trap door and rolled onto the cabin floor, gasping. Margaret was already pulling Sophie away from the opening. What happened? What did you see? Someone is down there. Emma struggled to her feet. We heard footsteps. Following us. Margaret's face went pale. She moved to the trap door and shined her flashlight down into the darkness. The beam revealed nothing but the ladder and the stone floor far below. No movement, no shadow shifting, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Are you certain? Emma was certain. The sound had been real. The presence had been real. Whatever waited in those tunnels knew they had been there, knew what they had found. She looked at the journal, still clutched in her hand, at the map tucked into its pages, at the drawing of tunnels she had not yet explored. Someone else knew about this place. Someone who had been watching, waiting, and now they knew that the secret was no longer secret. They emerged from the cabin into late afternoon light that felt too bright after the darkness below. Emma's eyes watered as they adjusted. Sophie pressed against her side, still trembling from their hurried escape. What did you find? Margaret's voice carried urgent professionalism. Before you heard the footsteps, what was down there? Emma handed her the journal, the map, described the crates of ore samples, the mining tools with Sarah's initials carved into the handles. Margaret listened with the focused attention of a scientist encountering something extraordinary. We need to get samples tested. Proper documentation. If this is what I think it is, the sound of an engine cut through her words, not the distant rumble of a truck on the mountain road. Something closer, something approaching fast through the trees. Emma's stomach dropped. She knew that engine sound, had heard it in nightmares for 6 months. The smooth electric whine of a vehicle that cost more than she would make in 10 years of teaching. Brandon's Tesla emerged from the tree line and stopped 20 feet from where they stood, white paint catching the afternoon light, tinted windows revealing nothing of who waited inside. The driver's door opened. Brandon stepped out with his phone pressed into his ear, finishing a conversation with someone who probably billed by the hour. He wore hiking boots that looked brand new and a jacket that probably cost more than Emma's monthly food budget. His eyes swept the clearing, taking in Emma and Sophie and Margaret and the cabin with its sagging roof and collapsed porch. Finally, he ended his call and slid the phone into his pocket. You do not answer your phone, Emma. No signal up here. Victoria and I hired an investigator. GPS tracker on your car. Seemed wise given your tendency to make poor decisions. The words landed like blows. Emma felt Sophie stiffen beside her, felt her own hands clench into fists that wanted to swing but could not afford to. You are tracking me? Protecting family interests. Brandon gestured to a second man emerging from the passenger seat, camera equipment in his hands. This is Trevor Harris, property assessor. He will be documenting the cabin's condition for our lawsuit. You do not have permission to assess anything. Emma stepped forward, putting herself between Trevor and the cabin door. That property is mine. Actually, Brandon's smile was thin and satisfied. The will is in probate for 90 days, during which Victoria and I have the right to contest any distributions we believe resulted from diminished capacity or undue influence. Trevor was already raising his camera, photographing the Honda, the supplies, Margaret's truck, the cabin's exterior with its obvious decay. This is trespassing. This is family property. Brandon's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no in a way that stuck. We have every right to document its condition and ensure it is being managed responsibly. A second vehicle appeared. The Maserati looked even more absurd on the mountain road than the Tesla. Vanessa emerged in clothes that cost more than Emma made in a month, picking her way across the clearing in heels that were not designed for dirt. So this is where grandmother's dementia led her. Vanessa looked around with visible distaste. A mountain shack in the middle of nowhere. She walked toward Emma with the controlled aggression of a lawyer who had won too many battles to expect defeat. Now, Emma, let us be adults about this. You are homeless, living in your car with Sophie. Michael is very concerned about her welfare. The name hit Emma like a physical blow. Michael, her ex-husband. The man who had taken everything in the divorce and left her with nothing but debt and a daughter to raise alone. You have been talking to my ex-husband about me? Someone has to think about Sophie's best interests. Vanessa pulled a folder from her briefcase. We have documentation, photographs of you living in your vehicle, statements from Michael about the unstable living situation. A judge would be very interested. Brandon moved closer, tag-teaming with Vanessa in a practice coordination that suggested they had planned this confrontation down to the last word. We are prepared to petition for emergency custody review if you will not be reasonable about the property. The threat hung in the air between them. Emma felt Sophie press harder against her side, small fingers gripping her jacket so tightly the fabric pulled. Sign over the property. Vanessa's voice carried the tone of someone making a final offer. Take $100,000 cash. We will drop all custody concerns and you can get an apartment. Get stable. Provide Sophie with what she needs. She paused, the silence stretched. Or refuse, and we will destroy you in court. For the property and for Sophie. You cannot afford that fight, Emma. We can. Margaret stepped forward. Her voice cut through the tension with authority that came from decades of facing down university administrators and hostile peer reviewers. I do not believe we have met. Dr. Margaret Hayes, retired geologist. She extended her hand with enough force that Brandon had to either shake it or commit to obvious rudeness. I have been consulting on the property in question. It is quite fascinating from a geological perspective. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. Consulting on what basis? On the basis that Emma asked me to, which she has every right to do as the legal owner. The property's value is being contested. Vanessa shifted into lawyer mode. Any assessments or consultations conducted before the hearing are premature and potentially fraudulent. Margaret smiled. The expression held no warmth. I am not assessing value for sale. I am providing scientific analysis of geological formations. Perfectly legal and none of your concern. Trevor had finished photographing and moved back toward Brandon. Got everything I need. Brandon turned back to Emma. His expression had hardened. The pretense of concern stripped away to reveal something colder underneath. Lawsuit files Monday morning. 9 a.m. Last chance to avoid this becoming ugly. He held her gaze. 100,000. Take it and walk away. Emma looked at her brother, at her sister, at the people who should have been her safety net when Michael left. When the money ran out. When the car became their home. People who had laughed at her inheritance and were now desperate to take it from her. She thought about this journal in her backpack. The map showing tunnels they had not yet explored. The silver waiting in the darkness below. The sacred objects that Sarah had promised to protect. The covenant that had been kept for 158 years. Get off my property. Her voice did not shake. You have 10 seconds before I call the sheriff. There is no cell service here. Brandon's smile was patronizing. Then I guess you will find out how long I want to stand on my land without permission. The standoff lasted 5 seconds. 10. Brandon searching Emma's face for weakness, for the break that would let him push harder. He did not find it. Monday, 9 a.m. Hope you have made arrangements for Sophie's care, for when this goes badly for you. They left in their expensive vehicles. The Tesla and the Maserati kicked up dust that hung in the air long after the engine sounds faded into the mountain silence. Emma stood in the settling quiet, arms still around Sophie, trying to stop shaking. Margaret touched her shoulder. Her voice was gentle but urgent. You need to find what is in that sacred chamber now, before they come back with a court order. The drive back to Copperfield was silent. Emma's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white. Her mind raced through implications and possibilities and the cold reality that Brandon and Vanessa would use Sophie as a weapon if it meant winning. They would make her homelessness look like neglect. They would paint her as unfit. They would take her daughter to get at 40 acres of mountain property that might contain $30 million in silver. Or might contain nothing but a promise made in 1867 to a Ute elder whose descendants had long since scattered to the winds. Margaret drove ahead in her pickup, leading them back to town where phone signals worked and lawyers could be contacted and plans could be made. Emma followed the taillights through gathering dusk, watching shadows claim the mountains one ridge at a time. Sophie sat beside her, silent and still. The journal lay in her lap. She had not let go of it since they left the cabin. Mom? Yeah, baby? Uncle Brandon wants to take me away from you. He wants to scare me into giving up the property. Emma forced steadiness into her voice. He does not actually want custody. He just knows that threatening you is the best way to hurt me. Sophie was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, Her voice carried something that sounded like determination. I would never go with him. No matter what a judge said, I would run away. I would find you. He does not get to break us up. Emma's vision blurred. She blinked rapidly, clearing tears she could not afford to shed while driving mountain roads at twilight. It will not come to that, I promise. How do you know? Because we are going to fight, and we are going to win. Emma reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Because Grandma Grace believed in us, and Sarah believed in us, and we are not going to let them down. They reached Copperfield as the last light faded from the sky. Margaret's pickup turned onto Maple Street. The blue house with its geological garden waited, lights glowing warm against the mountain cold. Inside, Margaret made phone calls while Emma sat at the kitchen table with Sophie, drinking coffee that tasted like salvation after hours of fear and confrontation. The journal lay open between them, Sarah's words reaching across a century and a half to offer guidance. Thomas Brooks can see you tonight. Margaret hung up the phone. He is on his way. She sat down across from Emma. There is someone else you need to contact. Before the hearing, before your siblings can complicate things further. Who? Daniel White Eagle, Cultural Preservation Director for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. Margaret's eyes were serious. If Sarah really hid sacred objects in that mine, the tribe has legal standing to intervene in your case. Under federal heritage law, will they believe us? They have been waiting for your grandmother to finish what she started. Margaret leaned back in her chair. Grace contacted them 7 years ago, told them about the artifacts. They have been patient. Now it is time. Emma felt pieces sliding into place. Grace had not just hidden knowledge of the mine. She had been actively working to fulfill Sarah's promise, building relationships with the tribe, negotiating agreements, waiting for the right moment to hand everything to someone who would see it through. And she had chosen Emma, not because Emma was successful or wealthy or powerful, but because Emma was stubborn enough to keep a promise, even when keeping it cost everything. The knock at the door came 40 minutes later. Thomas Brooks was 60 years old with a face weathered by mountain living and eyes that suggested he had seen enough courtroom battles to know which ones could be won. He shook Emma's hand and sat down at the kitchen table and listened while she explained everything. The will, the cabin, the trapdoor in the mine below, the silver and the sacred objects, and the covenant Sarah had made with Running Wolf in 1867, Brandon and Vanessa's threats, the GPS tracker, the custody implications. When she finished, Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he pulled a legal pad from his briefcase and began writing. First things first, we file an emergency response to their lawsuit. Demonstrate that Rose was of sound mind. Medical records, attorney testimony, the video testament she recorded. Video testament? Thomas looked at Margaret, who nodded. Rose recorded a video 2 weeks before she died. At William Patterson's office. She knew your siblings would contest. She wanted her intentions on record. Emma felt something loosen in her chest. Grace had planned for this, had anticipated the battle and prepared weapons Emma did not know she had. Second, Thomas continued writing. We contact the tribal council tonight. Get Daniel White Eagle involved before the hearing. Federal heritage protections supersede state probate proceedings. If we can establish that the property contains Native American sacred sites, your siblings cannot touch it, regardless of what the state court decides. And third, Thomas set down his pen and looked at Emma directly. We find that sacred chamber. Document everything. Get photographs and video that prove Sarah's covenant was real, that your grandmother was protecting something significant, that you are the right person to continue that protection. The phone calls took hours. Emma spoke with Daniel White Eagle at 9:30. His voice was calm and measured, carrying the patience of someone who had spent years working within systems that had been designed to fail his people. Your grandmother contacted us 7 years ago. She described the artifacts, the chambers, the promise your ancestor made. We have been waiting. Waiting for what? For the right person to finish what Sarah Blackwood started. Daniel paused. Rose believed that person was you. Was she right? Emma looked at Sophie, asleep now on Margaret's couch. The journal still clutched to her chest. She thought about everything she had lost. The house, the marriage, Yoon, the life she had built and watched crumble. She thought about 7 months of sleeping in parking lots and pretending for her daughter's sake that everything was an adventure. Yes, Emma's voice came out steady. She was right. Then we will file intervention papers first thing Monday morning, before your hearing. The judge will have to consider tribal interest before ruling on anything. Thank you. Do not thank me yet. Daniel's voice carried weight. This fight is not over. Your siblings have money and lawyers and the kind of connections that make courts bend. But we have something they do not. What is that? A promise that is 158 years old. And people who believe promises should be kept. They spent the night at Margaret's house. Emma slept on the couch beside Sophie, waking every hour to check that her daughter was still there, still safe, still holding the journal that contained the words of a woman who had faced harder odds than this and survived. In the gray light of early morning, Emma read Sarah's final entries, written in 1918, 51 years after the covenant was made. The handwriting was shakier now, marked by age and illness, but the words were clear. I am dying. The sickness in my lungs will take me before spring. But I have kept my word. Running Wolf's sacred things remain safe, hidden where only my blood can find them. The silver waits too, enough for generations if used wisely. To whoever reads this after I am gone, remember what matters. Not the medal, not the money, the promise. Keep it, and you keep everything that makes us who we are. Break it, and you lose more than silver. You lose your soul. Emma closed the journal as Sophie stirred beside her. Outside the window, the sun was rising over mountains that had held these secrets for longer than anyone now living could remember. Monday was 2 days away. 2 days to find the sacred chamber. 2 days to document everything. 2 days to prepare for a battle that would determine whether she kept her daughter, her property, and her grandmother's legacy. 2 days to prove that some promises were worth more than $30 million. Emma stood and began gathering supplies. They had work to do. The return to the cabin took on the quality of a mission. Margaret drove the pickup loaded with documentation equipment, cameras and lights and measuring tools. Everything needed to create a record that could not be disputed. Thomas Brooks came with them, legal pad in hand, ready to witness and document and build the case that would be presented Monday morning. His presence felt like armor, like having someone in their corner who understood the rules of the game Brandon and Vanessa were playing. Sophie sat beside Emma in the Honda, the journal on her lap, the map spread across the dashboard. She had studied the tunnels all morning, memorizing the layout, tracing the paths with her finger. The sacred place is north. Her voice carried certainty. Past the first chamber, past where we heard the footsteps. Emma's hands tightened on the wheel. The memory of those footsteps still sent cold down her spine. Someone had been down there, someone who knew about the mine, someone who had been watching them. We stay together this time, all of us. No one goes anywhere alone. They reached the cabin at noon. The clearing looked different in daylight, less threatening. Just an old structure against a cliff face surrounded by trees that had witnessed more human drama than any of them could imagine. But the trapdoor waited, and whatever had made those footsteps was still down there somewhere. Margaret went first this time, her experience with caves and mines evident in the way she moved, testing each rung, reading the rock with flashlight sweeps that caught details Emma had missed. Stable formation, her voice echoed up the shaft. Good airflow, someone maintained this tunnel, kept it safe. They descended one by one, Margaret, then Thomas, then Emma, then Sophie. The darkness swallowed them like water closing over a diver's head, cool and complete and ancient beyond measure. The first chamber looked different, with 4 flashlights illuminating the space. The crates of ore stood where Emma had left them, the mining tools, the evidence of Sarah's 50 years of careful work. Thomas photographed everything. Margaret took samples. Sophie held the journal open to the map, guiding them toward the northern tunnel. This way. The passage narrowed as they progressed, ceiling dropping until Margaret had to stoop. The air grew colder. The mineral smell intensified. Water sounds grew louder, suggesting underground streams that had carved these passages long before Sarah arrived. After 200 feet, the tunnel opened into a natural cavern that made Emma gasp. Limestone formations hung from the ceiling, stalactites that had grown for millennia, each one a record of time passing drop by drop. The floor was uneven, water pooling in low spots and creating mirrors that reflected their flashlight beams back doubled and tripled. Against the far wall stood something that was not natural, a barrier, built from stones of different colors, stacked with deliberate care to fill a gap between floor and ceiling. Not random, not accidental, constructed by hands that knew exactly what they were hiding. Sarah's work. Margaret's voice was hushed. This has been here over a century, undisturbed. She touched one stone gently. Are you ready? Emma looked at Sophie, at her daughter's face illuminated by flashlight, seeing determination that had been forged in hardship, courage that should not have been necessary at 9 years old. We are ready. They worked slowly, removing stones one at a time, setting each aside with care that bordered on reverence. The wall was 3 feet thick. Sarah had not wanted anyone finding this by accident. Behind the barrier waited a chamber, perhaps 6 feet deep, naturally formed but protected by Sarah's construction from any who might have stumbled this far into the mountain. Emma aimed her light into the revealed space and felt time collapse around her. Wooden crates and woven baskets filled the small chamber. Everything dried despite the cavern's moisture, protected by Sarah's careful placement in the stone barrier that had kept weather and water away. Emma reached for the nearest basket with hands that remembered how to be gentle. The woven material felt impossibly fragile, ancient, sacred in ways that had nothing to do with religion and everything to do with the people who had created it. She lifted it out and set it on level ground. The lid came away revealing pottery fragments, each piece decorated with geometric patterns rendered in black against red clay. Symbols that told stories in a language Emma could not read but could somehow feel. These are old, Margaret's voice carried reverence. 200 years, maybe more. Ute ceremonial pottery. Emma photographed each piece before moving to the next container. Ceremonial objects wrapped in leather that had somehow survived. Beaded items with patterns that spoke of traditions passed down through generations. Tools made from bone and stone, carved with precision that suggested both utility and art. Mom, Sophie had opened a small wooden box. Look. Inside, wrapped in cloth so old it nearly disintegrated at touch, were 3 pages torn from Sarah's journal. The paper was fragile as ash, but the ink had held. Emma read by flashlight, voice shaking as she spoke words that bridged a century and a half. August 12, 1867. Met today with Ute elder. His name is Running Wolf. He knew I was here, knew about my mining, expected anger. Instead, he showed me kindness. He took me deeper into the mountain, showed me sacred chambers where his people performed ceremonies, places where young men came to become warriors, where ancestors left offerings. I felt ashamed standing there with my pickaxe and my greed. The second page continued Sarah's account. Running Wolf's stories about the mountain, about his people's connection to this place, about why the chambers mattered beyond any value they might hold. The third page made Emma stop reading and simply stare at words written in 1867 by a woman who had understood exactly what was being asked of her. I have hidden everything Running Wolf showed me behind a wall that looks natural. His people can reclaim it when time is right. I have also hidden my best silver samples. If greedy men come, they will find enough in the obvious places. But the real treasure, both sacred objects and finest silver, stays safe. Let these pages testify. I broke no laws, harmed no one, and I kept my word to a friend. If I die here, may my blood daughters who come after honor what I have protected. Thomas photographed everything. The baskets, the pottery, the torn journal pages. Every piece of evidence that would prove Sarah's covenant was real and that Grace had spent her life protecting something worth more than silver. This is enough, his voice echoed in the chamber. More than enough. No court in the country will let your siblings touch this property now. Emma should have felt relief, should have felt triumph. Instead, she felt the weight of what she had inherited settling onto her shoulders. Not just property, not just wealth, but a responsibility that stretched back generations and forward into futures she could not yet imagine. She looked at the sacred objects surrounding her, at the pottery and the beaded work and the bone tools that had been hidden in darkness for over a century. These things did not belong to her. They belonged to the descendants of Running Wolf, to the people whose ancestors had left them here. We need to contact Daniel White Eagle. Her voice was steady. Before we do anything else, these things need to go home. Sophie's hand found hers in the darkness, small fingers squeezing tight. Grandma Grace would be proud of you, Mom. Emma squeezed back, and Sarah would be proud of both of us. They climbed back to the surface as the afternoon light began to fade. The cabin looked different now. Not a worthless shack, but a guardian. A protector of secrets that had waited 158 years for the right person to find them. Emma's phone buzzed as they reached the clearing, signal restored now that they were above ground. A text from Brandon. See you Monday. Looking forward to watching you lose everything. Emma read it twice, then she typed a response. See you Monday. Looking forward to introducing you to federal heritage law. She hit send and watched the message disappear into the digital void. Then she turned to Margaret and Thomas and Sophie, standing together in the fading light of a day that had changed everything. We have work to do. 2 days to build an unbreakable case. 2 days to contact the tribe. 2 days to make sure that when Monday came, Brandon and Vanessa would face something they never expected. A family that kept its promises, no matter what it cost. The drive back to Copperfield felt different this time. Not the desperate flight of the morning, but something more like a march, a procession of people who had found what they were looking for and now understood the magnitude of what came next. Margaret drove ahead with Thomas, their trucks packed with evidence that would reshape everything. Emma followed in the Honda, Sophie beside her, both of them processing the weight of what they had discovered. The sun set behind the mountains in colors that no photograph could capture. Oranges and reds bleeding into purple, painting the sky with the kind of beauty that reminded Emma why she had become an art teacher in the first place. There was wonder in the world, if you knew how to look for it. Grace had taught her that. Sarah had lived it. Sophie broke the silence as they descended from the higher elevations. Mom, what happens if we win on Monday? Emma considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. If we win, the property is ours. The silver is ours. But more importantly, we get to keep the promise. We get to return the sacred objects to the people they belong to. We get to finish what Sarah started. And what happens to us? Emma reached over and touched her daughter's hair. We get a home, baby. A real one. With bedrooms and a kitchen and a door that locks. We get to stop sleeping in the car. We get to start living instead of just surviving. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. I think I will miss the car a little bit. Emma laughed. The sound surprised her. She had not laughed in weeks, months maybe. You will miss sleeping in a parking lot? Not the parking lot, Sophie's voice was serious now. But I will miss how close we were. You and me against the world. I will miss knowing that no matter how bad things got, we had each other. Emma's eyes stung. She blinked against tears that blurred the mountain road ahead. We will always have each other, Sophie. A house does not change that. Nothing changes that. Promise. I promise. They drove on in comfortable silence. Mother and daughter. Two survivors who had found something in the darkness worth fighting for. Ahead of them, the lights of Copperfield glowed warm against the gathering night. Behind them, the mountain kept its secrets, patient and eternal, waiting for the next chapter in a story that had been unfolding for 158 years. Monday was coming. The battle was approaching. But for this moment, driving through Colorado twilight with her daughter beside her, Emma allowed herself to believe that maybe, finally, the worst was behind them. The future waited, and for the first time in 7 months, it looked like something worth reaching for. The weekend passed in a blur of preparation. Emma barely slept. Every hour was consumed by documentation and phone calls, and the careful assembly of evidence that would determine whether she kept everything or lost it all. The weight of Monday pressed down on every moment, making simple tasks feel monumental and rest feel impossible. Saturday morning began before dawn. Emma woke on Margaret's couch with Sophie still sleeping beside her, and the first gray light of mountain morning filtering through windows that looked out on a world transformed. Yesterday she had been a homeless woman with nothing but a mysterious inheritance. Today she was someone who had found $30 million in silver and sacred artifacts that connected her to ancestors she had never known. The responsibility of it pressed against her chest like a physical weight. Margaret was already awake when Emma emerged from the living room. The geologist sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by rock samples and testing equipment. Her white hair wild from a night of work. She had not bothered to interrupt with sleep. Coffee steamed in a mug beside her. Notes covered every available surface. I have been running assays all night. Margaret looked up with eyes that were tired but bright with something like excitement. The wire silver quality is consistent across every sample. Museum grade. Better than museum grade. The kind of formation that geologists write dissertations about. She pushed a paper across the table toward Emma. Numbers and chemical symbols that meant nothing to someone who had spent her career teaching teenagers about light and shadow. What does this mean in terms of what we tell the court? It means your grandmother was not protecting a worthless shack. Margaret's voice carried weight. It means the property contains mineral deposits worth more than everything your brother and sister inherited combined. It means when we walk into that courtroom Monday morning, We walk in with facts that will make their lawyers choke on their assumptions. Margaret worked through the rest of Saturday and into the night, analyzing ore samples and preparing geological reports that detailed the silver deposits in language courts could understand. She documented each specimen with photographs and measurements. She created charts showing the vein formation and estimated yields. She compiled everything into a folder that looked like it belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a small-town lawyer's briefcase. Thomas Brooks arrived Saturday afternoon with legal pads and law books and the focused intensity of someone who had found a case worth fighting. He interviewed Emma for 3 hours, pulling every detail from her memory about Grace's behavior, her communications, her clear statements of intention. He made phone calls to William Patterson in Denver, confirming the circumstances of the will's execution and the competency evaluation that had accompanied it. That evaluation will be crucial. Thomas explained during a break for sandwiches that no one had time to taste. Grace knew this challenge was coming. She made sure there was documentation. Multiple doctors confirmed her cognitive function. Patterson can testify to her clarity during their meetings. And the video? Thomas smiled. The kind of smile lawyers get when they know they have a weapon the other side does not expect. The videos are ace. Grace recorded it specifically because she knew Brandon and Vanessa would contest. She addresses them directly, explains her reasoning, demonstrates the kind of strategic thinking that destroys any claim of diminished capacity. Daniel White Eagle drove down from the tribal headquarters on Sunday morning, bringing 2 elders and a folder of federal heritage documentation that represented the tribe's 7-year wait for this moment. The tribal vehicle pulled into Margaret's driveway just as the sun cleared the eastern peaks, bringing warmth that did nothing to ease the cold knot of anxiety in Emma's stomach. They gathered in Margaret's living room on Sunday evening, 6 people united by a promise made 158 years ago. Emma sat with Sophie on the couch, the journal open on the coffee table, Sarah's words serving as a silent witness to everything that had led them here. Daniel spread photographs across the table, the pottery fragments, the ceremonial objects, the beaded work and bone tools that had waited in darkness for over a century. His weathered hands moved with reverence as he arranged each image. These belong to the White River Band. His voice was soft but certain. My ancestor Running Wolf was their spiritual leader. When the forced relocations came, they had to leave quickly. There was no time to retrieve sacred objects from remote locations. One of the elders, a man whose white hair and lined face spoke of 8 decades lived close to the earth, leaned forward to study the photographs. His eyes glistened with moisture that he did not try to hide. My grandmother spoke of these things. He touched the image of a beaded ceremonial bag. She said they were lost forever, hidden somewhere in the mountains where we could never return. Daniel translated for Emma's benefit, though the old man's emotion needed no translation. He says this is homecoming. This is ancestors calling to descendants. This is circle completing. Emma felt the weight of the moment settle over her. Not just a legal case, not just a fight for property. Something deeper, something that connected her to people and promises in the long arc of history that bent toward keeping faith. Tomorrow's hearing will establish tribal interest in the site. Thomas spoke with the quiet confidence of a man who had prepared thoroughly. Under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, any property containing indigenous sacred objects falls under federal protection. The state court cannot order seizure or division without federal review. And my brother and sister? They can contest all they want. Daniel's voice carried steel. But they will be contesting against the United States government in the sovereign rights of a recognized tribal nation. Their lawyers are good, ours are better, and we have something they cannot buy. What is that? The truth. Monday morning arrived with the kind of cold that made bones ache. Emma dressed in her funeral clothes again because they were still the only professional outfit she owned. Sophie wore her school uniform, navy jumper pressed and clean, hair in braids that Emma had fixed by the bathroom mirror at 4 in the morning when neither of them could sleep. They drove to Denver in Margaret's truck, leaving the Honda at her house because Emma did not trust the check engine light to survive another 3-hour mountain drive. Thomas rode with them, reviewing notes. Daniel and the elders followed in a tribal vehicle, their presence a statement before any words were spoken. The courthouse occupied a building that had been designed to intimidate. Stone columns rising 3 stories, steps that seemed to go on forever. Everything about the architecture said that power lived here, and ordinary people entered at their own risk. Emma climbed those steps with Sophie's hand in hers. She felt small against the massive facade, insignificant. A homeless woman in a second-hand dress about to face opponents who could buy and sell her 1,000 times over. But she also felt something else, something that had been building since she first read Grace's letter, since she descended into the mine and found Sarah's journal, since she stood in the sacred chamber and understood what she had been trusted to protect. She felt ready. The courtroom occupied the fourth floor, high ceilings and wood paneling that gleamed with decades of polish. Spectator benches arranged in rows like church pews, a judge's bench elevated above everything else, positioned to look down on all who came seeking justice. American flags flanked the bench. The seal of the state of Colorado hung on the wall behind where the judge would sit. Everything about the room was designed to remind those who entered that they stood in the presence of power greater than themselves. Emma paused at the threshold, taking in the space where her future would be decided. The wood floor creaked under her feet. The air smelled of old aviar and furniture polish, and the particular mustiness that accumulated in buildings where important decisions were made. Light streamed through tall windows, catching dust motes that floated like witnesses from cases long concluded. Brandon and Vanessa were already there. Their lawyer, Stanley Richter, arranged papers at the plaintiff's table with the practiced efficiency of someone who charged $500 an hour and was worth every penny. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Emma's car. His watch caught the light every time he moved. A younger associate sat beside him, laptop open, ready to pull up whatever precedent or documentation the senior partner might need. Brandon sat at the end of the table, phone in hand even now, unable to disconnect from the constant flow of business that defined his life. He wore the same Tom Ford suit from the will reading, the same confident posture, the same absolute certainty that money would reshape reality to his preferences. He had not looked at Emma when she entered, had not acknowledged her existence, as if she were already defeated and therefore not worth noticing. Vanessa sat on Brandon's other side. Her Hermes briefcase rested against her chair leg. Her Cartier watch gleamed at her wrist. She had brought her own legal pad, her own pen, her own notes prepared in the precise handwriting of someone who trusted no one's preparation but her own. She did not look at Emma as she entered, did not acknowledge her sister's existence, just continued reviewing documents with the focused attention of a lawyer who had never lost a case and did not intend to start now. Thomas guided Emma to the defendant's table. Sophie sat in the front row of the gallery, right behind her mother, close enough to reach out and touch if needed. Margaret sat beside him. Daniel and the elders took positions at the end of the row, their presence drawing glances from the court staff who were not accustomed to seeing tribal representatives at routine probate hearings. Judge Martha Morrison entered at precisely 9 o'clock. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone rose and then sat, and the machinery of justice began to grind forward. Judge Morrison was in her mid-60s, with gray hair pulled back severely, and eyes that suggested she had heard every argument and excuse twice, and was not impressed by either. She reviewed the case file for several minutes, pages turning with soft whispers in the silent courtroom. Then she looked up and surveyed the assembled parties. This is a will contest. Plaintiffs Marcus Sullivan and Victoria Sullivan Morrison claim the distribution under Grace Oniven's will resulted from diminished mental capacity and undue influence by the defendant Emma Sullivan. She turned to Stanley Richter. Additionally, I have received an emergency intervention motion from the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. Mr. Richter, is the plaintiff aware of this development? Richter stood with smooth confidence. We are, Your Honor. We intend to demonstrate that any claimed tribal interest is irrelevant to the fundamental question of whether Mrs. Sullivan was mentally competent when she executed her will. Thomas rose in response. Your Honor, the tribal intervention is not merely relevant, it is dispositive. The property in question contains documented Native American sacred sites protected under federal law. Any attempt to seize or divide the property would violate the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. She made a note on the pad before her. We will address the intervention after hearing the primary arguments. Mr. Richter, proceed with your opening. Richter launched into his case with the polish of someone who had done this hundreds of times. He painted a picture of an elderly woman in decline, confused, easily manipulated, targeted by a granddaughter who had nothing and saw opportunity in an aging relative's vulnerability. The will distribution itself demonstrates irrationality. His voice filled the courtroom with practiced sincerity. The deceased left her successful grandchildren substantial but proportional inheritances. But she left the defendant, a homeless woman living in her car, a property that appears virtually worthless, $5 in cash and nothing else. This is not the decision of a sound mind. This is confusion. This is the result of manipulation by someone desperate for any advantage. Emma felt Sophie's hand reach through the gap in the gallery rail. Small fingers found hers and squeezed. She squeezed back and kept her face neutral. Furthermore, Richter continued, the defendant's current living situation raises serious questions about her ability to manage any property. She is homeless. She sleeps in a vehicle with her minor child. Her ex-husband has documented concerns about the child's welfare. These are not the circumstances of someone capable of responsible property ownership. He sat down with the satisfied air of someone who had landed every punch exactly where he intended. Thomas rose slowly. His voice was quieter than Richter's, but somehow carried more weight. Your Honor, the evidence will show that Grace Sullivan was not confused. She was deliberate. She was strategic. She was protecting something far more valuable than my learned colleague can imagine. And she chose Emma Sullivan as her successor, not despite Emma's circumstances, but because of them. He paused to let the words settle. Grace Sullivan watched her granddaughter face poverty, divorce, homelessness. She watched Emma protect her daughter's well-being despite having nothing. She watched Emma continue teaching, continue believing, continue choosing integrity over advantage. And Grace concluded that these qualities, not wealth, not success, not the ability to buy expensive lawyers, made Emma the right person to inherit a responsibility that has been kept for over 150 years. Brandon shifted in his seat. For the first time since Emma had entered the courtroom, he looked uncertain. We have medical records, Thomas continued, cognitive tests administered by Grace's physicians showing normal function in every category. We have testimony from her attorney documenting her clear understanding of her decisions. And we have something else, something Grace herself prepared because she knew this challenge was coming. He turned to the judge. We have her video testament. The video was played on a screen mounted to the courtroom wall. The bailiff dimmed the lights, and Grace Sullivan appeared sitting at a conference table that Emma recognized from William Patterson's office. She looked old in the video, fragile in a way that Emma had not wanted to remember. But her eyes were sharp, her voice was steady, and her words cut through the courtroom like blades. My name is Grace Sullivan. I am recording this on February 15th, 2024. I am of sound mind, and I am making this video because I know what is going to happen after I die. Grace leaned forward slightly, looking directly into the camera as if she could see through time to the courtroom where her grandchildren now sat. Brandon and Vanessa will contest my will. I know this because I know them. I have known them their entire lives. They see the world in terms of money and success and status. They measure worth by net worth. They believe they have earned what they possess, and they believe others have failed to earn what they do not possess. Emma heard Vanessa make a small sound, something between a gasp and a protest. But Grace continued, her recorded voice filling the courtroom. I love my grandchildren. All of them. I want that understood. But love does not mean blindness. Love means seeing people clearly and caring for them anyway. And I see Brandon and Vanessa clearly. They are successful. They are wealthy. They are impressive by every measure our society uses to evaluate human beings. Grace paused. Her eyes seemed to find Emma across the impossible distance of death. But Emma is different. Emma has faced poverty, divorce, homelessness. She has nothing by the measures Brandon and Vanessa use. But she has something they do not. She has character. The courtroom was absolutely silent. No one moved. No one whispered. Even Brandon had stopped checking his phone. Character is not built in boardrooms or law offices. It is built in parking lots at 2 in the morning when your daughter asks why you are sleeping in the car. It is built in gym showers at 5 a.m. when you wash your hair because you have no home. It is built in classrooms where you teach beauty to teenagers who do not care because you still believe beauty matters. Grace's voice grew stronger. Emma has been tested in ways Brandon and Vanessa never have, and she has passed every test. She protects Sophie's joy when she has nothing left to give. She keeps teaching when the world tells her to quit. She believes in goodness when goodness offers her nothing in return. That is rare. That is strong. That is why I trust her with the mountain property. Grace leaned back slightly, her expression shifting to something harder. The property is not what it seems. It contains something precious, something my great-grandmother Sarah Blackwood protected for 50 years, something I have protected for 45 more, a covenant, a promise, sacred objects that belong to the Ute people, hidden and guarded because greedy men would have destroyed them. Brandon looked at Vanessa. Some communication passed between them. Emma watched understanding begin to dawn on their faces. Emma will honor that covenant. She will return what was hidden. She will complete what Sarah started. I know this because I know her. Because I have watched her choose honor over advantage again and again, when choosing differently would have been easier. Grace's voice softened for her final words. Brandon, Vanessa, if you are watching this in a courtroom, fighting for property you do not need and cannot properly steward, stop. Let go. Your grandmother is asking you. Some things matter more than money. Some promises matter more than profit. Let Emma do what I have trusted her to do. She looked directly into the camera one final time. And Emma, my dear Emma, do not be afraid. Do not let them shake you. You have everything you need to finish this. Your word is your wealth. Everything else is just metal in the ground. I love you. I have always been proudest of you. The screen went dark. The lights came back up. And Emma realized tears were streaming down her face. She wiped them away with the back of her hand, not caring who saw. Not caring what the judge thought or what Richter might argue about emotional manipulation. Grace had spoken to her from beyond death, had told her she was proud, had trusted her with everything. Sophie's quiet sobs filtered through from the gallery behind her. Margaret's arm wrapped around the girl's shoulders. Even Thomas seemed affected, clearing his throat and adjusting papers that did not need adjusting. At the plaintiff's table, the reaction was different but equally profound. Brandon had set down his phone for the first time there all morning. His face had lost its color. He stared at the blank screen as if waiting for his grandmother to return and tell him it had all been a joke, that she had not really seen through him, that she had not spent her final weeks preparing to defeat him from beyond the grave. Vanessa's mask had cracked. Her professional composure had slipped just enough to reveal something underneath. Not guilt, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that she had underestimated the woman she had dismissed as a confused old lady with dementia. Judge Morrison sat in silence for a long moment. Her pen rested on her notepad. Her eyes moved from the blank screen to the plaintiff's table to Emma and back again. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight that had not been there before. The court will take a 15-minute recess. The gavel fell. The judge rose and disappeared through a door behind the bench. And Emma sat frozen in her chair, unable to move, unable to fully process what had just happened. Grace had known, had prepared for this moment with the same deliberate care she had brought to everything in her life, had recorded her thoughts, her reasoning, her faith in Emma, specifically so they could be played in this courtroom on this day. The strategic thinking involved was remarkable. The love it demonstrated was overwhelming. Thomas touched Emma's shoulder. That was powerful. He kept his voice low. But we are not done yet. The tribal intervention still needs to be heard. Stay focused. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes again, pulling herself together for whatever came next. 15 minutes felt like both an eternity and no time at all. Then the bailiff called the court back to order, and Judge Morrison returned to her bench with an expression that gave nothing away. The court will now hear from the tribal representative. Daniel stood with the dignity of someone who represented nations that had existed before courts and laws and the very concept of property rights. Your Honor, my name is Daniel White Eagle. I am Cultural Preservation Director for the Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council. I am here to assert tribal interest in the property known as the Blackwood Homestead under the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. He approached the bench and handed the judge a folder of documents. 7 years ago, Grace Sullivan contacted our tribal council. She informed us that her property contains sacred objects hidden by her ancestor Sarah Blackwood in 1867. Objects that had been entrusted to Sarah by a Ute elder named Running Wolf, who was my ancestor. Daniel's voice carried the weight of generations. Sarah Blackwood made a promise. She would protect these objects until they could be returned. Grace Sullivan kept that promise for 45 years. Now Emma Sullivan has found the sacred chamber. She has documented the artifacts, and she has contacted us to arrange their return. He turned to look at Brandon and Vanessa. The plaintiffs seek to seize or divide this property for financial gain. Under federal law, this is not permissible. The property contains protected indigenous heritage sites. Any action that would damage, disturb, or prevent the return of sacred objects violates federal statute. One of the elders stood slowly. He spoke in Ute, his voice carrying across the courtroom with the authority of age and tradition. Daniel translated. He says his grandmother told him stories of these objects, lost when his people were forced from their homeland, hidden by a woman of two bloods who kept faith when others did not. He says this is not a legal matter. This is a spiritual one, and spirits do not recognize courtroom authority. Judge Morrison listened with an expression that had shifted from professional neutrality to something more complex. When Daniel finished, she turned to Richter. Mr. Richter, your response to the intervention motion. Richter stood, but his confidence had diminished. He shuffled papers that suddenly seemed inadequate. Your Honor, the tribal claims are speculative. There has been no official archaeological survey. The alleged sacred objects have not been verified by qualified experts. Thomas rose immediately. Your Honor, we have documentation from Dr. Margaret Hayes, retired professor of geology from the Colorado School of Mines. She has examined the artifacts and confirmed their age and origin. We have photographs of every item. And we have Sarah Blackwood's journal from 1867, which describes in detail her covenant with Running Wolf. He handed a thick folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Judge Morrison reviewed the materials for several minutes. The courtroom remained silent. Emma watched the judge's face for any sign of which way she was leaning, but Morrison gave nothing away. Finally, she looked up. I have heard enough. The words hung in the air. Emma's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. The will contest is denied. Emma heard the words, but could not quite process them. Denied. The contest was denied. She had won. Medical evidence overwhelmingly supports Grace Sullivan's mental capacity at the time the will was executed. Judge Morrison's voice was firm. Cognitive tests show normal function. Attorney testimony confirms she understood her decisions. And her video testament demonstrates not only competence but exceptional clarity. She fixed Brandon and Vanessa with a stare that could freeze water. Your grandmother anticipated this challenge. She prepared for it. She recorded a video specifically because she knew you would contest. That level of strategic planning does not suggest diminished capacity. It suggests a woman who understood her family perhaps better than they understand themselves. Brandon's face had gone pale. Vanessa sat motionless, her expensive pen frozen over her notepad. Furthermore, federal heritage law protections apply to this property. The evidence presented demonstrates that the land contains Native American sacred sites requiring specific management. Any division or seizure would violate federal statute. Judge Morrison set down her gavel. The will of Grace Sullivan stands as written. Emma Sullivan is the sole legal owner of the Blackwood homestead and all associated property. Case dismissed with prejudice. The court awards costs and attorney fees to the defendant. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. Emma sat frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to fully comprehend that it was over, that she had won. Sophie's arms wrapped around her from behind, small body pressing against her mother's back through the gallery rail. Mom, we won. The words broke the spell. Emma turned and pulled her daughter over the rail and into her arms, holding her tight enough that Sophie squeaked in protest. They had won, against the money, against the lawyers, against siblings who had laughed at her and threatened to take her child. They had won. Thomas shook her hand with professional satisfaction. Daniel approached with the elders, offering congratulations in 2 languages. Margaret wiped tears from her eyes and did not apologize for them. But Emma's attention had moved to the plaintiff's table, where Brandon sat staring at the wood surface as if it held answers to questions he had never thought to ask. Vanessa was already gathering her things, moving with the efficient precision she brought to everything. Not defeated exactly, but recalibrating, already planning the next move in whatever game she was playing. Brandon was different. He looked broken in a way Emma had never seen. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor had cracked, revealing something vulnerable underneath. Emma left Sophie with Margaret and approached her brother. Brandon did not look up as she stopped beside the plaintiff's table. His hands lay flat on the polished wood. His expensive watch caught the light. Everything about him screamed success except his face, which screamed something else entirely. She knew. His voice was barely audible. Grandmother knew exactly what we would do. She predicted everything. Emma did not respond. Let him work through whatever realization was trying to surface. Victoria and I are successful, rich, respected. Brandon finally looked up. His eyes were red. But grandmother did not trust us. She trusted you. That hurts more than losing the property. Emma considered her brother. This man who had refused to lend her $2,000 when she was sleeping in her car, who had laughed at her inheritance, who had threatened to take her daughter just to gain leverage. She should hate him. Part of her wanted to hate him, but a larger part remembered the little boy who used to build pillow forts with her, who cried when their goldfish died, who once gave her his dessert because she looked sad. That boy had gotten lost somewhere along the way to the penthouse and the Tesla and the $50 million company. But maybe he was not gone entirely. You could have been trustworthy. Her voice came out softer than she expected. It is not too late. Brandon let out a breath that seemed to carry years of weight. I do not know how to be the person she saw in you. Start by showing up. Emma made a decision she was not sure she would not regret. Sophie's birthday is October 15th. 2 p.m. The apartment address will be on the invitation. Brandon looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What kind of gift should I bring? No gift. Emma held his gaze. Just yourself. Just show up. That is all she needs. That is all any of us ever needed. She turned and walked back to where her daughter waited. Sophie took her hand with the trust of a child who had never doubted that her mother would make things right. Even through the parking lots and the protein bars and the nights spent sleeping in a car that smelled of desperation. Even through all of it, Sophie had believed. And now that belief had been rewarded. Margaret embraced them both, her strong arms pulling them close. Daniel and the elders offered blessings in Ute, words that Emma did not understand but felt in her bones. Thomas gathered his papers with the satisfied efficiency of a lawyer who had won a case he believed in. The courtroom emptied slowly. Other attorneys with other cases began to filter in for the next hearing. The machinery of justice moving on to its next dispute, indifferent to the lives that had just been transformed. Behind them, Brandon remained at the plaintiff's table. Vanessa had already left, heels clicking down the courthouse corridor toward whatever awaited her next. Her briefcase swung at her side. Her back was straight, already moving on, already calculating her next move in whatever game she was always playing. But Brandon sat still, staring at his hands, looking like a man who had just realized the empire he built was missing the only foundation that mattered. His phone lay on the table beside him, screen dark, ignored for perhaps the first time in years. The Tom Ford suit that had looked so impressive this morning now seemed to hang on him differently, like armor that had failed. Emma watched him for a moment from across the courtroom. This man who had refused to lend her $2,000, who had tracked her car with GPS, who had threatened to take her daughter, who had laughed at her inheritance and called her a slumlord. She should leave, should walk out of this courtroom with her victory and her daughter and never look back. Should let Brandon sit with his defeat and figure out his own path forward. But Grace's words echoed in her memory. I love my grandchildren, all of them. And Sarah's words from the journal, my word is my wealth. And her own words to Sophie, spoken in a car parked in a Walmart lot what felt like a lifetime ago. Some people measure worth by what you own. Others measure it by who you are. Emma made a choice. She was not sure if it was the right one, but it felt like the kind of choice Grace would have made. The kind of choice that honored the promise rather than the profit. She walked back to the plaintiff's table. Brandon did not look up as she stopped beside him. His hands lay flat on the polished wood. His expensive watch caught the light. Everything about him screamed success except his face, which screamed something else entirely. Something that looked almost like grief. A whisper that the empty courtroom amplified despite his obvious wish to be unheard. Grandmother knew exactly what we would do. She predicted everything, every argument, every threat, every move we would make. Emma did not respond. Let him work through whatever realization was trying to surface. Let him sit with the understanding that his grandmother had seen him clearly and had judged him accordingly. Victoria and I are successful. Brandon finally looked up. His eyes were red in a way that suggested tears had been very close, even if they had not actually fallen. Rich, respected. We have everything anyone could want. Everything society says matters. He swallowed hard. But grandmother did not trust us. She trusted you, the homeless one, the failure, the one we laughed at. She looked at everything we built and decided it did not matter. That hurts more than losing the property. That hurts more than anything. Emma considered her brother, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, Past the suit and the watch and the carefully constructed image of success. Past the confidence and the cruelty and the absolute certainty that his way was the only way. And she saw something she had not expected. Something that looked almost like the little boy she remembered from childhood, the one who built pillow forts with her on rainy afternoons, who cried when their goldfish bubbles died and they had to flush him down the toilet, who once gave Emma his dessert at Thanksgiving because she looked sad and he wanted to make her smile. That boy had gotten lost somewhere, buried under board meetings and quarterly reports and the relentless pressure to be more, achieve more, accumulate more. But maybe he was not gone entirely. Maybe there was still something worth reaching. You could have been trustworthy, Emma heard herself say. Her voice came out softer than she expected. It surprised her. It is not too late. It is never too late to become the person you were supposed to be. Brandon let out a breath that seemed to carry years of weight, years of building walls and climbing ladders and measuring himself against standards that had nothing to do with the things that actually mattered. I do not know how to be the person she saw in you. His voice cracked slightly. I do not know how to be anything other than what I am. Start by showing up. Emma made a decision she was not sure she would not regret. Sophie's birthday is October 15th, 2 p.m. The apartment address will be on the invitation. She paused, let the words settle. Victoria will probably not come. That is fine. But you could just be there, not as the CEO, not as the successful brother, just as Uncle Brandon, just as family. Brandon looked at her with something that might have been the beginning of understanding. What kind of gift should I bring? No gift. Emma held his gaze. Just yourself, just show up. That is all she needs. That is all any of us ever needed. She left him there at the plaintiff's table, walking back to where her daughter and her new friends waited, walking toward a future that was uncertain but no longer terrifying, walking into a life that finally had room for hope. The drive back to Copperfield took 3 hours. Emma sat in the passenger seat of Margaret's truck and watched the mountains pass. Sophie slept in the back, exhausted by the emotion of the day. The journal lay in Emma's lap, Sarah's words keeping her company on the long road home. Daniel drove behind them with the elders. They had work to do, plans to make, sacred objects to retrieve and ceremonies to perform. The return of what had been hidden for 158 years. Margaret drove in comfortable silence for the first hour. Then she spoke, her voice thoughtful. What will you do now? Emma considered the question. 24 hours ago, she had been a homeless woman facing a lawsuit that could take her daughter. Now she owned property containing $30 million in silver and sacred artifacts that would soon go home to the people they belonged to. First, we return the sacred objects. That is the priority. The promise comes before everything else. And the silver? Emma looked out the window at mountains that had held secrets for longer than anyone could remember. I do not know yet. Some of it we can sell, enough to get stable, to get Sophie a home, to stop surviving and start living. She paused. But the rest, the main vein, I think it stays where it is. That is $30 million you are talking about leaving in the ground. I know, Emma's voice was steady. But Sarah did not mind at all. Grace did not mind it. There was a reason. Some wealth comes with obligations that outweigh the money. Margaret nodded slowly. Your grandmother would be proud. I hope so. Emma touched the journal, feeling the worn leather under her fingers. I hope they all would be. Sarah, Running Wolf, everyone who kept this secret and passed it forward. The sun was setting when they reached Copperfield. The same oranges and reds and purples that had painted the sky 2 nights ago when Emma first drove up this mountain, not knowing what she would find. The same beauty. But everything else had changed. Margaret pulled into her driveway. The blue house with its geological garden waited, lights glowing warm against the gathering darkness. Stay as long as you need. Margaret turned off the engine. The house has more rooms than I use, and I suspect you have work ahead that will require a base of operations. Emma felt gratitude that went beyond words. Thank you for everything, for believing us when you had no reason to. I believe the rocks. Margaret smiled. Geology does not lie, and neither did your grandmother. Sophie stirred in the back seat, waking slowly from dreams Emma hoped were good ones. Mom, are we home? Emma looked at the blue house, at the mountains rising behind it, at the road that led up to a cabin that was hers now, really hers, along with everything it protected. Not quite yet, baby, but soon, very soon. They climbed out of the truck into the cool mountain evening. Stars were beginning to appear overhead, the same stars that had watched over Sarah when she built her cabin. that had witnessed Running Wolf sharing sacred secrets with a woman of two bloods, that had kept silent vigil through 158 years of promises kept. Sophie took her mother's hand as they walked toward the house. Mom? Yeah, baby. We really won. We really won. What happens now? Emma squeezed her daughter's hand. Now we finish what great-great-great-grandmother Sarah started. We return what belongs to the Ute people. We honor the covenant. And then, Emma smiled for the first time since she could remember smiling without forcing it. Then we find out what comes next. Together. The door opened. Margaret's house welcomed them in. And somewhere in the darkness of the mountains behind them, a cabin kept watch over secrets that would soon be secrets no more. The promise had been tested. The promise had held. Now it was time to see it fulfilled. The weeks following the court victory moved with a strange quality of unreality. Emma woke each morning expecting to find herself back in the Honda, back in a parking lot, back in the life of constant calculation and quiet desperation. Instead, she woke in Margaret's guest room, in a bed with actual sheets, in a house that smelled of coffee and geological specimens, in the particular warmth of being wanted somewhere. Sophie adapted faster than Emma did. Children are resilient in ways that adults forget to be. Within 3 days, she had claimed a corner of Margaret's living room and as her homework station. Within a week, she had made friends with Betty Campbell's granddaughter, who visited the general store on weekends. Within 2 weeks, she was sleeping through the night without waking to check if anyone had noticed them parked somewhere they should not be. But Emma still startled at every unexpected sound, still counted money in her head even when there was nothing to count, still felt the ghost weight of 7 months pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her that security was an illusion and everything could collapse again at any moment. The business of the inheritance moved forward on its own timeline. Thomas Brooks handled the legal paperwork. Margaret continued her geological analysis. Daniel White Eagle coordinated with the tribal council about the sacred objects. Everyone had roles. Everyone had tasks. And Emma floated between them, trying to understand her place in a life that had transformed so completely in such a short time. 3 weeks after the court victory, they returned to the cabin. The drive felt different this time. No desperation, no fear. Just the mountain road unwinding beneath their wheels and the late March sun warming the air through windows that Emma could roll down without worrying about the heater failing. Spring had begun to touch the higher elevations. Snow retreated from exposed slopes. Water ran everywhere, streams fat with melt, the earth drinking deeply after a long winter sleep. Daniel drove ahead with 2 tribal elders. Margaret followed in her truck, loaded with documentation equipment. Emma brought up the rear in a rented SUV because the Honda had finally given up its mechanical ghost 3 days after the court hearing. The check engine light had been right all along. The timing belt had snapped on the highway outside Copperfield, stranding Emma and Sophie on the shoulder until Margaret arrived with a tow truck in the quiet observation that maybe it was time to let the old car rest. They pulled into the clearing as the afternoon light slanted golden through the pines. The cabin looked different in spring, less haunted, more hopeful. The sagging roof was still a problem. The collapsed porch still needed repair. But somehow the structure seemed to be waiting for something, anticipating what was about to happen. Emma climbed out of the SUV and helped Sophie down from the passenger seat. The girl had been quiet during the drive, clutching Sarah's journal to her chest, rereading entries she had already memorized. Something in her face suggested she understood the weight of this day, even if she could not fully articulate it. Daniel and the elders approached the cabin with the measured pace of people who did not rush towards sacred matters. They had prepared for this. Ceremonies had been planned, protocols had been discussed. The return of objects hidden for 158 years was not something to be done casually. Emma was about to follow them toward the cabin when she noticed something that made her freeze. A figure sat on the cabin's fallen porch beam. An old man, white hair pulled back from a weathered face, hands resting on knees that spoke of decades of hard use. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt and boots that had walked more mountain trails than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. He had not been there when they arrived. Or had he? Emma could not be sure. It was as if he had materialized from the forest itself, appearing between one moment and the next like a spirit given temporary flesh. Daniel stopped walking. His whole body went still with recognition. "Uncle Joseph?" The old man rose slowly. His movements were careful, deliberate, the motions of someone who had learned to conserve energy over many years. He was perhaps 78 or 80, but his eyes were sharp and clear and fixed on Daniel with an intensity that bridged the gap between them. "I have been waiting." His voice carried the roughness of age, but also something else. Something like patience refined over decades into its purest form. "For 40 years I have been waiting. Your grandmother said someone would come eventually. Someone who would finish what Sarah started." Emma felt Sophie press against her side. The girl's fingers found hers and held tight. This was the source of the footsteps in the tunnel, the presence they had felt watching from the darkness. Not a threat, a guardian. Daniel crossed the remaining distance and embraced the old man. Words in Ute passed between them. The elders joined the embrace one by one, a reunion of people connected by blood and history and secrets kept across generations. When they separated, Daniel turned to Emma. His eyes were bright with emotion he did not try to hide. "This is Joseph Running Deer. He is my father's uncle, Running Wolf's great-grandson. He has been guarding this place since Grace Sullivan asked him to take over the watch." Joseph's gaze moved to Emma, studied her with the same intensity he had shown Daniel, reading things in her face that she did not know were visible. "You look like her." His voice softened. "Like Sarah. The photographs do not show it well, but the resemblance is there. In the jaw. In the way you hold yourself when you are uncertain but refuse to show it." "You knew Sarah?" Joseph shook his head slowly. "She died 30 years before I was born. But I knew Grace, and Grace knew Sarah. The stories passed down. The blood remembers what the mind forgets." He gestured toward the cabin, toward the trap door that waited beneath the alcove floor. 40 years ago, Grace came to me. She was getting older, could not make the trip as often. She asked if I would watch over the sacred place, make sure no one disturbed what Sarah had hidden. Joseph's eyes grew distant with memory. "I have walked these mountains every month since then, checked the tunnels, made sure the barriers held. When I saw strangers coming, I would watch. Wait. Make sure they were not the kind of people who would take what did not belong to them." The footsteps we heard, Emma understood now. That was you. I needed to see who had found the entrance. Needed to know if it was time. Joseph's gaze returned to the present, to Emma, to Sophie, to the gathered tribal representatives who had come to bring sacred objects home. "When I saw you with the child, I knew." Grace had told me about her granddaughter, the teacher, the one she trusted above all others. Emma felt tears threatening. She blinked them back. "Why did you not show yourself then?" "Because some things need to happen in their own time." Joseph smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered face, revealing echoes of the young man he had once been. "You needed to fight your battle first, win your victory. Then the sacred things could go home properly, not in secret, not in shadow, but in light, with witnesses, with ceremony." Daniel touched Emma's shoulder. "He has been protecting you without you knowing, protecting the site, making sure your brother's investigators did not find what they were not meant to find." Emma looked at the old man who had spent 40 years keeping watch, who had walked these mountains month after month, year after year, guarding secrets that were not his own because someone had asked him to, because a promise had been made, because some things mattered more than convenience or comfort or any other consideration. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate, but Joseph nodded as if they were enough. "Your grandmother thanks me by trusting you. Sarah thanks me by what you are about to do. We are all just links in a chain that stretches back further than any of us can see. The important thing is that we do not break." They descended into the mine together. All of them this time, Emma and Sophie, Daniel and Joseph and the elders, Margaret with her documentation equipment. The darkness swallowed them as it had before, but this time it felt different, welcoming rather than threatening, as if the mountain itself knew what was about to happen and approved. The sacred chamber waited at the end of the northern tunnel. Sarah's stone barrier had been partially dismantled during Emma's first visit, revealing the artifacts that had been hidden for over a century. Now, in the combined light of multiple flashlights, the full scope of what Sarah had protected became clear. Pottery and baskets, ceremonial objects wrapped in leather that had somehow survived, beaded work telling stories and patterns that had been passed down through generations, bone tools carved with precision, and in the back of the chamber, something Emma had not noticed before. A bundle wrapped in cloth so old it seemed held together by memory alone. Joseph approached this bundle with the reverence of someone entering holy space, His aged hands trembled slightly as he unwrapped the layers. Inside was a headdress, eagle feathers arranged in patterns that spoke of rank and honor, beadwork that caught the flashlight beams and threw back colors that had not faded despite 158 years of darkness. This belonged to Running Wolf. Joseph's voice was barely a whisper. When the soldiers came, there was no time. He gave it to Sarah because he knew she would keep it safe. The old man held the headdress carefully, cradling it like something infinitely precious. Tears ran down his weathered cheeks. He did not wipe them away. My grandmother told me stories about this, said it was lost forever, said the spirits had taken it home to keep safe until the people were ready to receive it again. He looked at Emma with eyes that held grief and joy in equal measure. They did not take it home. They gave it to your ancestor, and she kept it safe. For 158 years, your family has protected what should have been destroyed, what should have been stolen, what should have been forgotten. Joseph pressed the headdress to his chest and wept. The elders gathered around him, speaking words in Ute that Emma did not understand but felt in her bones. Words of thanks, words of homecoming, words that bridged a century and a half of separation. Sophie's hand found Emma's in the darkness. When Emma looked down, she saw her daughter crying too. Not with sadness, with something larger. With the understanding that she was witnessing something that mattered, something that would ripple forward through time in ways none of them could predict. The documentation took hours. Margaret photographed every object. Daniel recorded descriptions in both English and Ute. The elders examined each item with careful attention, identifying pieces they recognized from stories and pieces they did not. History was being reassembled in real time. Fragments of a culture nearly destroyed being gathered back together. When they finally emerged from the mine, the sun was setting behind the western peaks. The sky burned with colors that no photograph could capture. Orange bleeding into red, into purple, the whole world painted in shades of fire. They gathered in the clearing before the cabin, a rough circle of people who had been strangers weeks ago and were now connected by something stronger than blood. Emma stood with Sophie on one side and Joseph on the other. Daniel and the elders faced them. Margaret watched from slightly outside the circle, respecting that this was not her moment but bearing witness anyway. Daniel spoke first. His voice carried across the clearing with the power of formal ceremony. For 158 years, the covenant has been kept. Sarah Blackwood made a promise to Running Wolf. She kept that promise until her death. Grace Sullivan continued that protection for 45 more years. And now Emma Sullivan has brought the sacred things home. He paused. The silence held weight. The Ute Mountain Ute Tribal Council officially accepts the return of these objects. We acknowledge the sacrifice of those who protected them. We honor the promise that was made and kept across 5 generations. Joseph stepped forward. His voice was older but carried equal weight. My ancestor Running Wolf told Sarah that time would reveal all truths. He was right. Time has revealed that some people keep their word even when breaking it would be easier. Time has revealed that honor exists even in ages that try to destroy it. Time has revealed that Emma Sullivan is worthy of the trust her grandmother placed in her. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small. A carving, stone-shaped by patient hands into the form of an eagle in flight. This was Running Wolf's. He gave it to Sarah as a token of their friendship. She gave it to Grace. Grace gave it to me for safekeeping. Now I give it to you. He pressed the carving into Emma's hand. The stone was warm from his body heat, smooth from decades of being held by people who understood its significance. The silver stays with you. Running Wolf said the earth gives what it gives. The sacred objects come home to us. But the covenant, the promise that belongs to your family now, pass it forward. Teach your daughter. Make sure the chain does not break. Emma held the carving and felt the weight of what it represented. Not just the stone itself, but everything it meant. The trust, the responsibility, the connection to people who had lived and died and kept faith through circumstances that should have made faith impossible. I will. Her voice was steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. I will teach Sophie. She will teach her children. The chain will not break. Sophie stepped forward. Her small face was serious with understanding that went beyond her 9 years. I promise too. She looked at Joseph, at Daniel, at the elders. I promise to remember. I promise to tell the stories. I promise that the Blackwood covenant will always be kept. Joseph smiled. The expression crinkled the lines around his eyes and transformed his weathered face. Running Wolf would have liked you. He valued courage in small packages. The ceremony continued as the sun completed its descent and stars began to emerge. Words were spoken, songs were sung, blessings were offered in languages that had been spoken on this land for thousands of years before Sarah Blackwood built her cabin against the cliff face. When it was over, when the sacred objects had been carefully packed for transport to the tribal cultural center, when the elders had said their farewells and driven away into the mountain darkness, Emma stood alone with Sophie before the cabin. Margaret had gone to bed in her truck. Daniel had left with Joseph. The clearing was empty, except for the two of them and the ghosts of everyone who had stood here before. Mom? Yeah, baby? What happens to the silver? Emma had been thinking about this for weeks, had run the numbers, had considered the options, had wrestled with the question of what it meant to have access to $30 million when you had spent 7 months with nothing. We sell some of it, enough to buy a home, enough to never sleep in a car again, enough to stop being afraid. And the rest? Emma looked at the cabin, at the trap door visible through the crooked doorway, at the mountain rising behind, holding secrets that had been kept for over a century. The rest stays where it is. Sarah did not mine it all. Grace did not mine it. There was a reason. What reason? Some wealth comes with obligations. Emma chose her words carefully. The silver is connected to this place, to the sacred chambers, to the promise. If we take everything, we break something that cannot be fixed. But it is $30 million. I know, Emma pulled her daughter close. And we are going to leave most of it in the ground, because that is what Sarah would have done. That is what Grace would have done. That is who we are. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. Uncle Brandon would think we are crazy. Probably. But we are not crazy. No, Emma smiled. We are keeping a promise. That is different. The transaction happened 3 weeks later. Harrison Wright, a private collector whose museum consulting work had made him expert in exactly the kind of silver Sarah had extracted, traveled to Copperfield to examine the ore samples. He was a tall man in his 60s with silver hair that matched the specimens he studied and hands that moved with reverent precision when handling the chunks of wire silver Emma had brought up from the mine. His assessment took 4 hours. His conclusion took only seconds. $4.5 million for the sample collection. Cash transaction. His voice carried the certainty of someone who knew exactly what he was looking at. Additionally, I would like to feature select pieces in the Denver Museum of Natural History. Exhibition fees of $120,000 annually. Emma tried to process numbers that still did not feel real. That was more than she would make in 100 years of teaching, more than enough to transform their lives completely. One condition. Her voice was steady despite the magnitude of what she was agreeing to. 10% of the sale proceeds go directly to the Ute Mountain Ute Cultural Preservation Fund. Wright's eyebrows rose. That is $450,000 you are giving away. Sarah made a promise. Emma met his gaze. I am keeping all of it, not just the convenient parts. The transaction finalized within a week. $4.5 million reduced by attorney fees, and the tribal donation left Emma with $3,780,000. More money than she had ever imagined having. More than enough for everything she and Sophie needed. But the main vein remained untouched. The $30 million worth of silver that ran deep into the mountain, following geological formations that had been created millions of years before humans existed. Emma had the right to extract it. The legal paperwork was clear. No one could stop her. But Sarah had not extracted it all. Grace had not extracted it all. And Emma would not either. Some promises required leaving money in the ground. The first thing Emma bought was a home. Not a mansion. Not anything that would have impressed Brandon or Vanessa. Just a 3-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and a park within walking distance. A place where Sophie could have her own room, where Emma could have a kitchen with actual appliances, where they could close a door that locked and know they would still be there in the morning. Moving in took less than a day. They did not have much to move. The plastic bins from the Honda's trunk, the clothes they had worn for 7 months, Sophie's school supplies and Emma's art supplies, the journal that had guided them here, the pocket watch that still kept perfect time after 158 years. That first night, Sophie stood in the doorway of her bedroom and simply stared. The room was small, 10 feet by 12, white walls that would need decorating, a window that looked out on the apartment building next door. Nothing special by any objective measure. But to a girl who had spent 7 months sleeping in a car, it was a palace. This is mine. This is yours. And no one can take it away. No one. Emma knelt beside her daughter. This is our home. Bought with our money, protected by our name. No one can ever make us leave. Sophie walked into the room with the careful steps of someone afraid the floor might disappear. She touched the walls, opened the closet, looked out the window at the world that was now visible from her own personal space. Then she turned and ran back to Emma, throwing her arms around her mother with enough force to nearly knock them both over. Thank you. The words were muffled against Emma's shoulder. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for keeping the promise. Emma held her daughter and let the tears come. After 7 months of holding everything together, after weeks of legal battles and emotional confrontations, and the constant grinding weight of uncertainty, she finally let herself feel it. The relief, the gratitude, the overwhelming joy of having reached the other side of something that had seemed impossible. They stood there in the doorway of Sophie's new bedroom, mother and daughter, crying and laughing and holding each other as if they might float away without the anchor of each other's arms. The second thing Emma did was return to Henderson High. Her principal seemed surprised when Emma walked into the office the Monday after spring break ended. Surprised and somewhat confused. Mrs. Sullivan, I thought you would be, he gestured vaguely. Retired, wealthy, whatever happens when people suddenly come into money. Emma took a seat across from his desk. I came into money. That part is true, but I did not come into a different identity. I am still a teacher. These students still need someone to show them that beauty matters. The principal studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled. Your position has been held. We assumed you were not coming back, but we have been using substitutes. He shook his head slowly. You know you do not have to do this. I know. Emma returned his smile. That is why I want to. She walked into her classroom that afternoon for the first time in almost a month. The familiar smell of paint and graphite. The natural light from windows she had fought to have uncovered. The student work still hanging on walls where she had placed it before her life had changed completely. 23 juniors stared at her when she entered, some with curiosity, some with the blank expressions of teenagers who had trained themselves not to care about anything adults found important. But a few looked at her differently. A few had heard rumors. A few had seen news coverage of the tribal ceremony, or the court case, or the story of the homeless teacher who had inherited a fortune and chosen to keep a promise instead of keeping all the money. Mrs. Sullivan? One of the curious ones raised a hand. Is it true you found treasure in a mountain? Emma set her bag on her desk and turned to face the class. I found something valuable. Whether you call it treasure depends on what you think matters. She paused. Today we are going to talk about value, not monetary value. Artistic value, the kind of worth that cannot be measured in dollars. The students settled into their seats. Some of them still looked skeptical. But more of them were paying attention than had paid attention to any lesson Emma had given before everything changed. She had always believed that art could reach people, could show them something about themselves in their world that they had not seen before. Now she had proof. She had lived through darkness and found light, had possessed nothing and discovered everything. And she was going to spend the rest of her career teaching these teenagers that they could do the same. The dedication ceremony happened in September. 6 months after the court victory, 6 months of preparation and planning and the careful choreography of bringing together people who had never had reason to be in the same place before. The cabin had been restored, not renovated, preserved. The original structure maintained with repairs that honored rather than erased its history. The roof no longer sagged, the porch no longer collapsed. But the logs were still the same logs Sarah had cut and fitted 158 years ago. 75 people gathered in the clearing on a Saturday afternoon when the aspens had begun to turn gold against the evergreen darkness. Tribal members from the Ute Mountain Ute Council, Margaret and Betty and Thomas and others from Copperfield. Historians and journalists and people who had read about the story and wanted to witness history being acknowledged. And Brandon. He arrived alone, no Tesla this time. He had rented a Jeep, appropriate for the mountain roads. He wore jeans and a flannel shirt that looked new but represented effort, an attempt to fit in rather than stand out. Sophie saw him first. She broke from Emma's side and ran across the clearing, throwing herself into his arms before he could prepare himself for the impact. Uncle Brandon, you came! Brandon held his niece carefully, as if she were something precious and fragile. I promised I would. He looked up and met Emma's eyes across the space between them. Something had changed in his face over the past months. The sharp edges had softened. The constant evaluation had been replaced by something that looked almost like presence, like he was actually here rather than already calculating his next move. Emma walked over and stopped a few feet away. "You look different." "I feel different." Brandon set Sophie down but kept his hand on her shoulder. "I have been doing some thinking about what grandmother said in that video, about what it means to measure worth. And what have you concluded? That I have been using the wrong scale." Brandon's voice carried weight that came from genuine reflection rather than performance. "That buildings and bank accounts and all the things I spent my life accumulating do not actually add up to much. Not compared to what you have." "What do I have?" Brandon gestured at the gathering, at the tribal members and the neighbors and the daughter who still held his hand, at the cabin and the mountain and the story that had brought them all here. "This, people who trust you, a promise you kept when breaking it would have made you rich. A child who knows she is loved." He paused. "I have a penthouse and a company and more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But I do not have this. I never knew how to build it." Emma looked at her brother, really looked at him, saw the uncertainty behind the new softness, the genuine struggle to become something different than what he had been. "It is not too late to learn." The ceremony began as the afternoon sun reached its golden angle. Emma stood at the front of the gathered crowd. Sophie beside her, the restored cabin at her back. A bronze plaque had been mounted near the entrance, the words chosen to honor everyone who had played a part. She read the inscription aloud for those gathered. "Sarah Blackwood, Sacred Heritage Site. In honor of Sarah Blackwood, 1845 to 1918, who built with her hands and kept her word. Grace Sullivan, 1930 to 2024, who protected what was not hers to take. Emma Sullivan, who chose honor over wealth. Protected by covenant. Preserved for generations." Daniel White Eagle spoke next. His voice carried across the clearing with the power of tradition and the weight of history finally acknowledged. "For 158 years, 3 generations of women have taught us what stewardship means. They protected what belonged to our people when our people could not protect it themselves." Sarah understood something that her era refused to recognize. That land and legacy and the sacred things hidden in mountains do not truly belong to anyone. We are all just caretakers, passing through, responsible for what we find and what we leave behind. He paused and looked at Emma. This family learned that lesson better than most. They kept a promise when keeping it cost them comfort and wealth and the approval of those who measured worth differently. They chose honor over advantage. They chose covenant over profit. Daniel turned to address the full gathering. "Today we witness the completion of that promise. The sacred objects have gone home to our cultural center. The land remains in the care of Emma Sullivan and her descendants. And the story becomes part of our shared history, a reminder that some things matter more than money, that some people can be trusted even when trust seems foolish, that some promises once made are kept forever." Sophie surprised everyone by stepping forward to speak. Her small voice carried across the clearing with a clarity that made grown men lean in to listen. "Mom and I were homeless 6 months ago. We slept in our car. We ate peanut butter sandwiches for every meal. We counted every penny and still came up short." She paused, looked at the faces watching her. "We could live in a mansion now. We could have everything. But we chose to keep the promise instead. We chose to give back what was not ours to keep. We chose to leave most of the silver in the ground because that is what great-great-great-grandmother Sarah would have done." Sophie's eyes found Brandon in the crowd. "Uncle Brandon came today. He promised he would, and he kept that promise. That matters more than any gift he could have brought. Keeping your word matters more than anything else." She turned back to face everyone. "I am going to teach my children about this someday, about Sarah and Running Wolf, about Grandma Grace and Joseph Running Deer, about promises that last longer than the people who make them. That is what this family does. We keep promises." The applause that followed was not the polite acknowledgement of a crowd being social. It was something raw, something that came from people who had been moved, who had heard a 9-year-old speak truths that adults often forgot, who understood that they were witnessing something rare. The ceremony ended as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Sage smoke rose from the blessing the elders performed, curling toward skies that had watched over this land since before memory began. Songs were sung in languages that had survived despite every attempt to erase them. And slowly, gradually, the gathered crowd began to disperse. Brandon lingered after most had gone. He stood with Emma and Sophie as the last light faded and the first stars appeared. I was wrong. His voice was quiet. About so many things. About you. About what matters. About who grandmother was and why she made the choices she made. Emma did not argue. Did not say I told you so. Just stood beside her brother as the mountain darkness gathered around them. What are you going to do now? I do not know. Brandon actually smiled, a genuine expression rather than the calculated version she had seen in boardrooms and courtrooms. Maybe learn how to be a person instead of just a resume. Maybe figure out what matters to me beyond the next acquisition or quarterly report. That sounds like a good start. Sophie tugged at his hand. Will you come to my birthday? For real this time? Not just because Mom asked? Brandon knelt so he was at her level. I will come to every birthday you will have me at, I promise. Sophie studied his face with the seriousness of a child who had learned to evaluate adult promises carefully. Okay, but remember, in this family, promises are forever. She hugged him quickly, then ran off to help Margaret pack up the last of the documentation equipment. Brandon watched her go with an expression that might have been wonder. She is remarkable. She learned from remarkable women. Emma touched her brother's arm. And she is watching you now. Watching to see if you become someone worth watching. Brandon nodded slowly. I am going to try. That is all I can promise right now. That I am going to try. It was enough. It was the beginning. It was more than Emma had expected, and maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something that could heal wounds she had thought permanent. The clearing emptied as night claimed the mountain. Emma stood alone before the cabin, Sophie asleep in the SUV, the others gone to their separate destinations. The bronze plaque caught starlight and held it, the words visible even in the darkness. Protected by covenant. Preserved for generations. Emma pulled the pocket watch from her jacket. Sarah's watch, the one that had been given to her in 1870 and had kept perfect time ever since. She held it to her ear and listened to the steady tick, the mechanical heart that had outlasted everyone who had ever held it before. Time reveals all truths, the inscription read. And it had. Time had revealed that Brandon's success was hollow without connection, that Vanessa's achievements were empty without purpose, that Emma's poverty had been the crucible that proved her worthy of trust that spanned generations. She thought about the $30 million still sleeping in the mountain, silver that would never be touched because some promises mattered more than any profit. She thought about Sarah dying in this cabin in 1918, having kept her word to Running Wolf for 51 years. About Grace visiting every few months for 70 more years, protecting what was not hers to claim. About Joseph walking these mountains for 4 decades, guarding secrets that were not his own because someone had asked him to. And she thought about teaching art on Monday morning, about standing in front of teenagers who mostly did not care and helping them see that beauty existed even in failure, even in poverty, even in the hardest places life could construct. Because that was the real inheritance. Not the money, not the property, but the understanding that some things were worth more than comfort or wealth, or the approval of people who measured worth in zeros on bank statements. The cabin door stood open, revealing the restored interior. Emma walked inside and stood in the space Sarah had built with her own hands. The pot-bellied stove had been replaced with a replica. The shelves held new tin cups to replace the ones that had oxidized beyond saving. But the walls were the same walls. The logs fitted with the same precision. The spirit of the place unchanged despite the years. Emma knelt in the northeast corner where the trap door waited beneath new floorboards. She did not open it, did not descend into the tunnels, just rested her hand on the wood and felt the mountain's heartbeat through layers of timber and stone. You did good, Sarah. She spoke to the empty room, to the woman who had died 106 years ago, but whose presence still filled this space. You kept your word. You protected what mattered. You passed the promise forward. She stood and walked to the door, looked out at the clearing where history had been acknowledged and wounds had begun to heal. I will keep it too. The promise, the covenant, everything you trusted us with. The mountain did not answer. Mountains never do. But something shifted in the quality of the silence. Something that felt like acknowledgement, like the closing of a circle that had been open for a century and a half. Emma closed the cabin door behind her and walked to the SUV where Sophie slept. Tomorrow they would return to their apartment. to the life they were building from the wreckage of everything that had fallen apart, to school and teaching and the ordinary rhythms of existence that had seemed impossible just months ago. But tonight she would sit in the clearing a little longer, would watch the stars wheel overhead, the same stars that had watched over Sarah and Running Wolf and Grace, and every person who had kept this secret and passed it forward. "Your word is your wealth," Sarah had written in the journal that now sat in a place of honor in Emma's living room. "Everything else is just metal in the ground." Emma understood now what that meant. Not that money was worthless, but that keeping faith with the dead and the living and the yet to be born mattered more than any fortune buried in stone. That teaching Sophie to see the world through Sarah's eyes was worth more than $30 million. That the real treasure was not silver, but the knowledge that when tested she had chosen right. The pocket watch ticked steadily in her jacket pocket, keeping time as it had for 158 years, 158 years of women who had faced hard choices and made the right ones, 158 years of promises kept. And now a new generation to carry it forward. Sophie would learn the stories, would teach them to her own children someday, would make sure the chain remained unbroken, the covenant honored, the promise kept. Emma started the SUV and began the long drive down the mountain. Behind her, the cabin kept watch as it had for over a century. The mountain held its secrets, patient as stone. And somewhere in the darkness, she imagined she could hear Sarah's voice, carried on wind through pine branches, whispering that some promises were kept forever, by those who understood what truly mattered.